Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Settle in gently and let the older Mediterranean come forward at its own pace. The sea roads, the harbors, the council chambers, the mountain passes, and the long roads where armies once moved under dust and winter cloud. In today's journey, we follow Hannibal Barca, the son of a defeated Carthaginian general, raised in the shadow of Rome, shaped in the hard military world of Iberia, and remembered as the commander who brought war across rivers, tribes, snow, and stone into Italy itself. He won battles that frightened the Roman Republic to its foundations. Yet the story is not only about victory, it is also about endurance, distance, supply, loyalty, politics, and the strange strength of a city that refused to admit it had been beaten. If you enjoy these long-form history documentaries, a quiet like and subscription helps the channel continue to grow. New deep historical journeys are published regularly, and your comments are always welcome. Where you are listening from, which subjects you would like covered next, and which corners of the past you would like to spend time inside. So let the history begin in Carthage after the First Great War with Rome, where a young boy grew up inside a family that had not forgotten defeat. Chapter 1. A Child of Carthage. Hannibal Barca was born in 247 BC in a city that was still learning how to live with defeat. Carthage stood on the North African coast, facing the Middle Sea with its harbors, warehouses, shipyards, and counting houses. But the confidence that had carried its merchants across the western Mediterranean had been badly shaken. The First Punic War had ended only a few years before his birth. Sicily, long contested between Carthage and the Greek cities and then Rome, was gone from Carthaginian hands. The peace with Rome had not been a gentle settlement. Carthage had been required to pay a heavy indemnity, surrender its claims in Sicily, and accept the fact that a rival city, once a power of central Italy, had forced its will across the sea. The loss was not only territorial, it touched revenue, prestige, naval standing, and the confidence of families whose wealth and honor had long depended on maritime power. A child born into one of those families would have grown up among adults who remembered the old war not as a story, but as an unfinished wound. Carthage itself was ancient by Hannibal's day, founded by Phoenician settlers from the eastern Mediterranean, and enlarged over centuries into one of the great cities of the West. Its language, religion, and many customs remained Punic, tied to the older Phoenician world, but its life was shaped by trade routes that reached far beyond the narrow streets of the city. Ships moved between North Africa, Sardinia, Sicily, Iberia, and the Balearic Islands. Cargoes of metal, grain, timber, cloth, oil, pottery, and human beings passed through its networks, carried by merchants who knew winds, harbors, credit, and risk. The city's harbors gave physical form to that power. Ancient writers described the commercial harbor and the military harbor, with the inner naval basin arranged around facilities for ships. Even allowing for later embellishment, Carthage's maritime organization was real and formidable. A boy of high family did not need to understand every account ledger or every naval order to sense that the city lived by movement. Masts, hulls, ropes, warehouses, dock labor, and foreign speech belonged to the world around him. Hannibal's family belonged to the ruling military aristocracy, though Carthage was not ruled by kings in the old heroic manner. Its government rested on councils, magistrates, prominent families, and political factions whose exact workings are known imperfectly through Greek and Roman observers. The leading magistrates, often called Sophites, shared some resemblance to judges or chief officials. Behind them stood councils of wealthy and experienced men, and in moments of war, generals could gain enormous personal authority if they commanded money, soldiers, and success. The Barcid name came from Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca. Barca is often understood as meaning lightning or thunderbolt, a name that later seemed to fit the family's sudden and dangerous energy. Hamilcar had fought in Sicily during the final years of the First Punic War, when Carthage's position there had already become difficult. He had commanded from strongholds, used irregular tactics, and preserved a reputation for skill even as the wider war slipped away. In a defeated city, that kind of reputation mattered. The war had been long and exhausting. Rome and Carthage had fought not for a single battlefield, but for command of sea routes, island bases, and the political future of Sicily. Naval losses were severe on both sides. Fleets had to be built, crews trained, money found, and citizens persuaded or compelled to bear the strain. When Rome finally gained the upper hand at sea, Carthage could no longer sustain the contest. The peace of 241 BC ended the war, but it did not end the pressures created by it. One of the first pressures came from Carthage's own soldiers. Many of the men who had fought for Carthage were not citizen soldiers in the Roman pattern. They came from Libyan communities, Numidian groups, Iberian peoples, Gauls, Greeks, and other hired or allied forces, held together by pay, command, and expectation. After the war, disputes over payment helped ignite the brutal mercenary war, a conflict that nearly destroyed Carthage from within. Hannibal was still very young, but his earliest years belonged to a city surrounded not by peace, but by unpaid armies, rebellion, fear, and emergency. Hamilcar played a central role in suppressing that rebellion. Ancient accounts of the mercenary war are harsh and often grim, but the larger meaning is clear enough. Carthage survived a crisis that exposed the danger of depending on armies whose loyalty had to be purchased and managed across many languages and customs. For the Barcid family, the lesson was practical rather than abstract. War required money, settlement, discipline, food, animals, ships, and the careful handling of men who did not all belong to the same people. A child in Hamilcar's household would have heard the names of places and peoples not as distant geography, but as part of family business. Sicily, Sardinia, Africa, Iberia, Rome, and the islands of the Western Sea all belong to the conversation of power. The Mediterranean was not a blue emptiness between lands. It was a working space crossed by merchants, envoys, warships, grain vessels, and rumors. Decisions made in a senate house at Rome or a council chamber at Carthage could alter the price of loyalty in a camp or the security of a harbor. Hannibal's childhood also unfolded inside a religious world older than Rome's presence in the West. Carthage honored deities such as Baal Hammon and Tanit, and public religion formed part of civic identity, family standing, and political life. Temples, offerings, vows, and rituals were not separate from statecraft in the ancient world. They belonged to the way cities understood danger, gratitude, victory, and loss. A family like Hannibal's would have known that public action often stood beneath divine witness. Much about Hannibal's early private life is hidden. Ancient historians cared far more about his later campaigns than about his nursery, tutors, games, or household routine. Yet some careful outlines can be drawn. As the son of Hamilcar, he would have been raised among the expectations of rank, command, and public service. He likely learned Punic as his native language and later moved through military and diplomatic worlds where Greek, Iberian languages, and other tongues mattered. Education for such a boy would not have been ornamental. It prepared him to inherit danger. The household of a leading Carthaginian commander was not simply a private refuge. It was tied to clients, allies, servants, soldiers, political friends, and rivals. Messengers came and went. Decisions about ships, money, marriages, and appointments could pass close to family rooms. Children in such houses learned early that adult life was not only made of personal preference, it was made of obligation, memory, faction, and the ability to keep one's place among men who watched closely. Rome, meanwhile, was becoming more than a name of resentment. In the middle of the 3rd century BC, it was still a republic of Italy, not yet the ruler of the Mediterranean, but its strength had already become unmistakable. Roman citizens served in legions, allies supplied troops, magistrates held command for limited terms, and the Senate gave continuity across yearly offices. To Carthaginian eyes, Rome could appear stubborn, aggressive, and unusually able to recover from loss. That quality would shape Hannibal's whole life. The contrast between the two powers was already visible. Carthage was wealthy, maritime, commercial, and accustomed to using mixed armies under professional commanders. Rome was land-rooted, citizen-based, and tied to a widening network of Italian allies whose obligations could be turned into military force year after year. Neither system was simple. Neither was weak, but they endured strain in different ways, and the boy born into Hamilcar's house would one day test those differences more severely than anyone before him. There is a famous story that gives Hannibal's childhood its most enduring image. According to ancient tradition, before Hamilcar left for Iberia, he brought the young Hannibal to an altar and made him swear never to be a friend of Rome. The exact wording cannot be recovered, and the story comes to us through writers who knew Hannibal mainly as Rome's great enemy. Still, the tradition survived because it captured something ancient readers believed to be true. Hannibal's life was joined early to his father's unfinished war. The oath should not be treated as if a scribe stood nearby recording every word. Its value lies in the memory it preserves. Hamilcar's household carried the bitterness of defeat, the discipline of military recovery, and the conviction that Carthage's future could not remain confined by Roman victory. Hannibal did not grow up in an ordinary peace. He grew up in the aftermath of a settlement his father had never accepted in spirit, surrounded by the practical work of rebuilding power. Iberia soon became the place where that rebuilding would take form. Carthage needed money, soldiers, metal, and room for ambition away from the immediate pressure of Rome. Hamilcar looked west toward a land of silver mines, fortified communities, tribal alliances, difficult terrain, and opportunity. For Carthage, Iberia offered more than compensation for Sicily. It offered the chance to create a new base of strength, one not yet fully measured by Rome. When Hannibal left Africa as a boy, he was not simply traveling with his father to a distant province. He was moving from the wounded grandeur of Carthage into a harsher school of command. In Iberia, the son of Hamilcar would watch armies being assembled from different peoples, cities being won by force or agreement, wealth being pulled from the earth, and loyalty being made through pay, marriage, fear, respect, and victory. The man who would one day cross the Alps began as a child of defeat, commerce, oath, and military reconstruction. Carthage gave him memory. Hamilcar gave him direction. Iberia would give him soldiers, methods, and command. Long before Rome saw him in Italy, Hannibal had been shaped by a city that could not forget what it had lost, and by a family determined to turn loss into preparation. Chapter 2: Hamilcar's Oath. The story of Hannibal's hatred for Rome begins with his father, Hamilcar Barca, and with a defeat Hamilcar never accepted as final. The First Punic War had ended in 241 BC, but for men who had fought through its last years, peace did not erase the memory of lost ships, abandoned strongholds, unpaid soldiers, and the surrender of Sicily. Hamilcar had not been beaten in the ordinary way of a commander who loses a single field. He had survived at the edge of a failing war, holding out while the larger Carthaginian position collapsed around him. In Sicily, Hamilcar had commanded from the western part of the island, around strong positions such as Mount Eryx. The war there was not a clean contest of two armies meeting once and settling the matter. It was a war of harbors, hill forts, raids, supply lines, naval support, and patient pressure. Hamilcar learned how to make limited resources last, how to trouble an enemy stronger in one place by moving sharply in another, and how to preserve command authority among troops who did not all share language, homeland, or loyalty. The peace came through Carthage's exhaustion rather than through Hamilcar's personal surrender in battle. That distinction mattered in the memory of the Barcid house. A state might accept terms because it lacked ships, money, or political will, while a commander could still believe that the enemy had not truly broken him. Hamilcar returned from Sicily with reputation intact, but reputation could not restore the island. Sicily became Rome's first province, and Carthage had to pay for the privilege of ending the war. The indemnity placed weight on an already strained city. Carthage was rich, but ancient wealth was never an endless pool of coins waiting to be opened. Money had to be gathered through taxes, tribute, trade, land revenues, and the pressure placed on subject communities. Ships had to be maintained, creditors satisfied, and political rivals answered. A settlement written between states became, in practice, 1,000 smaller burdens carried by farmers, merchants, magistrates, and treasurers. No pressure was more immediate than the problem of the army. Carthage's forces included large numbers of hired and allied soldiers who expected payment after the long Sicilian War. Many had endured hard service and believed they were owed more than Carthage was ready or able to give. When negotiations failed, resentment turned into revolt. The Mercenary War, sometimes remembered by ancient writers as the Truceless War, was not a border campaign against a familiar enemy. It was an internal convulsion, fought against men who had once served under Carthaginian command. Hamilcar's role in this crisis strengthened his position. He was not the only Carthaginian commander involved, and the war included other leaders and brutal reversals. But Hamilcar emerged as one of the men capable of restoring order. He understood the mixture of discipline, supply, negotiation, and force required when armies came from many peoples. A camp could not be ruled by speeches alone. Men needed food, pay, confidence in their officers, fear of punishment, and belief that obedience still offered more safety than rebellion. The young Hannibal's earliest years therefore belonged to a household where war was not distant memory. The family would have known the anxieties of a city under pressure, the movement of messengers, the uncertainty of public decisions, and the watchfulness that surrounds powerful men after crisis. Hamilcar was not merely a father returning from service. He was a political figure whose future depended on victory, faction, and the ability to turn military success into lasting authority. Carthaginian politics did not give a general unlimited freedom. Prominent families competed for influence, councils debated policy, and commanders could be praised, blamed, recalled, or investigated. A successful general needed backing at home as much as obedience in the field. Hamilcar's later actions suggest a man who understood that Carthage's survival required more than mourning Sicily. It required a new source of strength, a new theater of action, and a new military foundation beyond Rome's immediate reach. The famous Oath of Hannibal belongs to this moment between humiliation and renewal. Ancient tradition says that when Hamilcar prepared to leave for Iberia, he brought his son to a sacrificial altar and asked whether the boy wished to accompany him. Hannibal, still a child, eagerly agreed. Hamilcar then made him place his hand upon the offering and swear that he would never be a friend to Rome. The story is simple, almost too perfect, and it survived because it gave later generations a clear image for a long and complicated life. No one can recover the exact scene with certainty. The writers who preserved the story belonged to a world that already knew Hannibal as the enemy of Rome, and childhood stories often become shaped by the meaning of a person's later fame. Yet the oath should not be dismissed as empty legend. It tells something true about how ancient families understood loyalty, inherited duty, and public hatred. In a world where vows, sacrifices, household gods, and political memory carried weight, a father could bind a son to a cause before the son fully understood its cost. The altar in the story matters because it places politics under divine witness. Carthaginian religion, like Roman religion, did not separate public life from sacred obligation in the modern manner. Treaties, wars, offices, and family duties could all be framed by ritual acts. For Hamilcar, Rome was not only a rival state that had won Sicily, it was the power that had narrowed Carthage's future, humiliated its commanders, and forced the city into payment. To make a son swear against such an enemy was to turn resentment into inheritance. Hannibal would have been about 9 years old when Hamilcar departed for Iberia, if the chronology is followed in its usual form. At that age, a child of high family could already understand rank, approval, fear, and the seriousness of adult expectation, even if he could not yet grasp the full machinery of Mediterranean war. The oath, whether given exactly as later writers told it or remembered in a more symbolic form, placed him inside his father's unfinished purpose. Rome became part of the moral weather of his upbringing. Hamilcar's decision to go west was practical as well as emotional. Iberia offered minerals, manpower, and distance from the direct supervision of Rome. Its silver deposits could help Carthage pay its debts and rebuild its military strength. Its peoples, divided among many communities and leaders, could be fought, allied with, recruited, taxed, or drawn into the Barcid system. The land was not empty, and it was not easy. That was part of its value for a commander who needed space to act. The expedition to Iberia was not a simple appointment to a peaceful province. Hamilcar crossed into a region of fortified settlements, local rulers, rugged landscapes, and old trade contacts along the coast. Some communities had known Phoenician and Carthaginian merchants for generations, while others stood beyond easy control. Armies moving inland had to secure food, guides, pack animals, river crossings, and winter quarters. A commander who wanted lasting power could not merely raid and leave. He had to build relationships, impose fear, reward loyalty, and create administrative habits strong enough to survive his absence. Hannibal's education now changed in character. Whatever instruction he had received in Carthage was joined to the harder school of the campaign. He saw soldiers from different peoples gathered under one command. He saw how a general received envoys, judged disputes, distributed reward, and punished disobedience. He learned that authority in the field depended on memory. Men remembered whether a commander paid them, fed them, protected them, and shared danger with them. Hamilcar did not command like a distant magistrate. Ancient accounts suggest a leader of personal force, able to win attachment from soldiers and fear from enemies. His son would have watched the daily mechanics behind that reputation. Camps were laid out, scouts sent forward, animals driven, weapons repaired, and food measured. Officers carried orders through ranks that did not all speak the same tongue. Victory in such a world began long before battle, in the discipline that kept a mixed army from dissolving into its separate parts. The Barcid project in Iberia also had a political meaning at home. Carthage had lost Sicily and, soon after, Rome took Sardinia as well, deepening the resentment between the two powers. Iberia became a way of answering loss without immediately declaring another war. From the Carthaginian point of view, expansion there could be described as recovery, compensation, and necessity. From the Roman point of view, a strong Carthaginian military house building power in the West would become a cause for suspicion. A quiet but important feature of this period is that Hamilcar's power grew partly outside the ordinary balance of Carthaginian civic life. He was acting for Carthage, but the soldiers, wealth, alliances, and settlements gathered in Iberia also strengthened his own family. The Barcids were not kings, yet in the West they began to resemble a dynasty of commanders. Sons, sons-in-law, brothers, officers, and local allies formed a network around conquest. Hannibal grew up inside that network, learning command not as an abstract office, but as a family inheritance. The ancient Mediterranean often joined family ambition to state ambition. A noble house could serve its city sincerely, while also enlarging its own name, wealth, and following. Hamilcar's campaigns gave Carthage resources it badly needed, but they also gave the Barcids a base from which they could shape policy. This double character would later matter greatly. Hannibal's war with Rome would not arise from one man's private anger alone, yet private family memory helped give the conflict its direction and intensity. Hamilcar died in Iberia around 229 BC, according to the usual chronology, after years of campaigning. Accounts differ in detail, but his death came in the midst of the military world he had chosen, not in retirement at Carthage. By then, Hannibal was no longer the small boy at the altar. He had spent formative years among armies, Iberian leaders, Punic officers, and the rough political geography of conquest. His father's oath had become daily experience: Rome as enemy, Carthage as wounded city, Iberia as the place where revenge could be prepared. The inheritance Hamilcar left was not a finished empire, but a direction. He had shown that Carthaginian strength could be rebuilt away from the islands Rome had taken. He had tied his family to Iberian wealth and manpower. He had given his son a military education rooted in movement, hardship, mixed command, and long resentment. Hannibal would later become a commander of rare independence, but the first shape of his life belonged to Hamilcar's design. In that design, the oath was only the most memorable image. Behind it stood years of debt, defeat, rebellion, councils, voyages, camps, bargains, and campaigns across unfamiliar country. A boy's hand on an altar gave later writers a scene to remember. The deeper oath was lived more slowly in the West, where Hamilcar taught his son that Rome's victory had not ended the struggle, and that a patient enemy could prepare for years before the next war began. Chapter 3: The Spanish Empire of the Barcids. Iberia was not a blank western field waiting for Carthaginian ambition. It was a large, difficult, varied land with river valleys, hill forts, mining districts, coastal trading towns, inland peoples, and older routes of exchange that had long tied parts of the peninsula to the Mediterranean. Phoenician and Punic merchants had known its shores for generations. Greek traders had touched its eastern coast as well. Yet the Barcid presence under Hamilcar, and then under his successors, gave Carthaginian activity there a new military weight. The peninsula offered what Carthage needed after the loss of Sicily and Sardinia. It had silver, copper, soldiers, horses, timber, and distance from Rome's immediate pressure. Its communities were not united under one power, which made them vulnerable to a commander who could fight one group, bargain with another, and turn local rivalries into opportunity. For a city burdened by indemnities and wounded prestige, Iberia was not only a place of expansion, it was a reserve of recovery. Hamilcar began this Western project with the habits of a commander who had learned from defeat. He did not simply raid the coast and return to Africa with plunder. He moved inland, made alliances, took strongholds, and tried to shape a durable base. Such work required far more than courage in battle. A general had to know where grain could be found, which rivers blocked movement after rain, which communities might provide cavalry, which local leaders could be trusted, and which promises had to be secured by hostages, marriage, or force. The young Hannibal grew up within this machinery. He saw Iberia not as a distant province on a map, but as a living school of war and government. He would have watched interpreters at work, envoys arriving with gifts or grievances, soldiers waiting for pay, and officers learning the temper of men who served for profit, loyalty, fear, or honor. The army around him was not a single national body. It was a mixture held together by command and by the growing prestige of the Barcid name. The human scale of this new power lay in daily arrangements. Pack animals had to carry grain, tents, tools, and spare weapons. Blacksmiths repaired spearheads, bridles, fittings, and armor. Scouts rode ahead through country where a wrong valley could lead an army into hunger or ambush. A fortified town did not fall because a commander desired it. Men had to cut timber, drag equipment, fill ditches, break gates, or negotiate terms with those inside. Hamilcar's authority in Iberia rested partly on victory and partly on distribution. Soldiers who crossed sea and mountain for Carthage expected reward. Local allies expected protection, gifts, recognition, or advantage over their rivals. Mines and tribute could sustain command, but they also created obligations. Silver did not become military power by itself. It had to be extracted, guarded, weighed, transported, minted, or exchanged, and turned into pay, food, weapons, animals, and political favor. In this world, Hannibal's education became unusually broad. He was learning not only how men fought, but how power was assembled. A commander needed cavalry from one people, infantry from another, guides from a third, and money from the earth beneath them all. He needed to speak through translators without appearing weak, to judge the loyalty of chiefs whose customs differed from his own, and to keep Carthaginian officers from despising allies whose service they still required. The army was a moving society, and he was being raised to govern it. Hamilcar's death around 229 BC left the Barcid project unfinished. Ancient accounts describe him dying during campaigning after years of hard expansion. He had carried Carthaginian influence inland and given his family a new center of gravity, but he had not yet created the stronger political and military structure that later generations would associate with Barcid Spain. His death might have weakened the whole enterprise if authority had returned immediately to distant Carthage, or if local alliances had dissolved. Instead, command passed to Hasdrubal, known as Hasdrubal the Fair. Hasdrubal was connected to the Barcid house by marriage, and his style appears to have differed from Hamilcar's. Where Hamilcar is remembered above all as a hard military commander, Hasdrubal gained a reputation for diplomacy, organization, and political settlement. He understood that Iberia could not be held forever by campaigns alone. Towns, chiefs, soldiers, merchants, and Carthaginian interests needed a center around which to gather. In that need lay one of the most important developments in Hannibal's youth. The city that later writers called New Carthage became the heart of Barcid Spain. Known today as Cartagena, it occupied a strong position on the southeastern coast, with a fine harbor, access to inland routes, and proximity to rich mining districts. Its name itself carried meaning. It was not merely another captured town or fortified depot. It was a western echo of the old city in Africa, a place where Carthaginian authority could be seen in walls, docks, storehouses, administrative routines, and military planning. A closer look at New Carthage helps explain the strength that Hannibal would later draw upon. The harbor allowed ships to bring supplies, officials, and messages across the sea. Storehouses could hold grain, weapons, metal, and equipment. Nearby silver mines gave the Barcids access to one of the most important resources in the ancient world. Hostages from Iberian communities could be kept there as guarantees of loyalty, while envoys and officers moved through its public spaces, carrying the business of an expanding command. The mines were not romantic things. They meant labor, darkness, tools, overseers, transport, and careful accounting. Ore had to be brought out, processed, and moved under guard. The wealth that appeared in diplomatic gifts or soldiers' pay began with hard physical extraction. For Carthage, silver helped answer the demands created by Roman indemnities and by the maintenance of armies. For the Barcids, it gave independence of movement, because a commander with money in hand could act with far greater freedom than one waiting on every decision from home. Hasdrubal strengthened his position through marriage diplomacy as well as administration. Ancient sources report that he married an Iberian woman of high standing, a union that signaled more than private attachment. Marriage could become a political bridge, a way to bind local elites to a foreign commander and to present the Barcid presence as something more durable than occupation. A wedding alliance could soften the edge of conquest where battle alone would leave resentment. It could also tell neighboring communities that the new power intended to remain. Rome watched these developments with concern, though not yet with the full urgency that would come later. The Roman Republic had emerged from the First Punic War with Sicily and then Sardinia, and it had reason to distrust any Carthaginian recovery. At the same time, Roman attention was divided among Italian affairs, northern threats, and wider Mediterranean diplomacy. Iberia lay at a distance, but distance did not make it harmless. A Carthaginian military base there could become, in time, a new source of pressure. The treaty associated with the Ebro River belonged to this climate of suspicion and caution. Rome and Hasdrubal reached an agreement, usually dated to 220-26 BC, limiting Carthaginian expansion beyond the Ebro. The details and later interpretation would become important, especially because Saguntum lay south of the river, yet held a relationship with Rome. For the moment, the agreement showed that Rome recognized the scale of Barcid power. It also showed that Hasdrubal could act in ways that resembled the head of a Western state, negotiating directly over boundaries and spheres of action. Hannibal, by then a young man, was watching two kinds of power work side by side. From Hamilcar, he had inherited the memory of hard campaigning and the idea that Rome must eventually be confronted. From Hasdrubal, he saw the value of cities, treaties, hostages, mines, marriages, and careful political form. A commander who understood only battle could win ground and lose it again. A commander who understood institutions could make conquest settle into something more useful. The army forming around the Barcids reflected this mixture. Iberian infantry served alongside Libyan troops, Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers, and other forces connected to Carthaginian power. Each group brought different weapons, habits, and expectations. Balearic slingers were prized for their skill with stones and lead shot. Numidian horsemen, riding light and fast, could harass, scout, and unsettle heavier enemies. Iberian warriors carried their own martial traditions, local loyalties, and fierce pride. Hannibal's later brilliance would depend partly on his ability to use these differences without letting them break his army apart. Command in such an army required memory and tact. Men had to be placed where their strengths mattered. Cavalry could not be treated like heavy infantry, and slingers could not be used as if they were shield-bearing line troops. Pay, plunder, praise, and discipline had to be distributed with care, because resentment in a mixed army could spread through language groups and tribal ties. Hannibal's reputation among his soldiers later became one of his greatest assets. Its roots lay in years spent among precisely this kind of force. Hasdrubal's rule ended suddenly. In 221 BC, he was assassinated, reportedly by a man connected to a local grievance. The killing reminds us that Barcid Spain, for all its organization, remained a world of negotiated and contested power. Fortified cities, treaties, marriages, and mines could not remove the resentments created by conquest. One man's diplomacy might be another family's humiliation. The blade that killed Hasdrubal cut through the careful order he had been building. After his death, the army chose Hannibal as commander, and Carthage confirmed the choice. He was still young, around 26 years old, but he had been formed for this moment almost from childhood. The soldiers knew him as Hamilcar's son and as a man who had grown up among them, rather than arriving fresh from the council rooms of Africa. Ancient writers emphasize his resemblance to his father in spirit and command. Whether that resemblance was exact or embellished, it helped give legitimacy to his rise. Hannibal inherited more than an army. He inherited New Carthage, mining wealth, Iberian alliances, trained officers, family prestige, and a strategic position that Rome could not ignore forever. He also inherited limits. Iberian loyalty had to be maintained. Carthaginian politics still had to be considered. Rome's suspicions were real. The Ebro Agreement placed a boundary on paper, while local disputes continued to create opportunities for conflict. Power had been assembled, but its direction had not yet been finally chosen. The Spanish Empire of the Barcids was therefore both an achievement and a preparation. It gave Carthage a second foundation after the losses of the First Punic War. It gave Hannibal the soldiers and money without which his later invasion of Italy would have been impossible. It taught him how to move among different peoples, how to command beyond the customs of a single city, and how to treat geography as a field of possibility. Long before the Alps, there was Iberia, the western forge where a defeated family turned memory into military strength. Chapter 4: Saguntum and the Road to War. The road to the Second Punic War did not begin with a sudden march on Rome. It began with a city on the eastern coast of Iberia, with disputed alliances, old resentments, careful legal arguments, and the difficult question of how far a great power could extend its protection. Saguntum stood south of the Ebro River, near the Mediterranean, in a position that made it useful to anyone watching the balance between Rome and the Barcids. It was not one of the largest cities of the age, but in the years after Hasdrubal's treaty, its name gained a weight far greater than its walls. The Treaty of the Ebro had tried to place a line on ambition. Hasdrubal had agreed not to expand Carthaginian power beyond that river, which lay to the north of Saguntum. On paper, this seemed to leave the city within the southern zone where Barcid influence could operate. Politics, however, rarely rests quietly inside geography. Saguntum had developed ties with Rome, and Roman friendship could change the meaning of a place even when the map appeared to favor Carthage. For Hannibal, now commander in Iberia, the situation tested the inheritance he had received. His father had taught him that Rome's victory after the First Punic War could not be the final word. Hasdrubal had built a structure of power that depended on cities, alliances, treaties, mines, and controlled boundaries. Saguntum stood inside that structure like a question left unanswered. If Rome could protect a city south of the Ebro, then Carthaginian authority in Iberia might be narrowed without a battle having yet been fought. Ancient accounts differ in emphasis, as they often do when war is being justified after the fact. Roman writers presented Saguntum as a loyal friend attacked unjustly by Hannibal. Carthaginian arguments, as far as they can be reconstructed through hostile sources, treated Roman involvement as an intrusion into territory where Carthage had not violated the Ebro Agreement. Both sides cared about law, but law was not separate from power. Each interpretation served a larger fear. Before Saguntum came fully to the center, Hannibal spent his first years as commander strengthening Barcid control. He campaigned against Iberian peoples, secured territory, and showed the army that Hamilcar's son was not merely the heir of a name. Success in the field mattered because the army had chosen him, and soldiers who choose a commander still require proof that the choice was sound. Victories brought plunder, confidence, and obedience. They also warned neighboring communities that the new commander would not preside passively over his inheritance. A Carthaginian army in Iberia was a practical organism before it was an instrument of grand strategy. Men needed grain, wine, animals, shoes, tools, tents, and weapons. Cavalry horses had to be fed and replaced. Slingers needed suitable stones or cast lead shot. Infantry from different peoples had to be placed under officers who could understand their habits and discipline their quarrels. When Hannibal prepared for a siege or a campaign, he did not move an idea across the land. He moved thousands of bodies and all the small necessities that kept them alive. Saguntum's conflict with neighboring groups helped draw Hannibal closer. The city was involved in local disputes, and such disputes were often the doorway through which larger powers entered. A quarrel between communities could become a test of alliance, honor, and deterrence. If Hannibal ignored Saguntum, he risked appearing weak before Iberian allies and subject peoples. If he attacked, he risked provoking Rome. The balance was not comfortable, and perhaps that discomfort was precisely what made the crisis difficult to contain. The city itself was fortified and not easily taken. Saguntum sat on rising ground with defenses that forced an attacker into sustained work rather than a quick display of force. Walls had to be approached, not wished away. Siege operations required timber, earthworks, engines, shields, ladders, guards, labor crews, and repeated attempts under danger from those above. The defenders had the advantage of height and enclosure. The attackers had time, numbers, and the determination of a commander who understood the political meaning of delay. Hannibal began the siege in 219 BC. The ancient accounts describe a hard struggle with assaults, wounds, exhaustion, and stubborn defense. Details may have been shaped by later moral memory, but there is no doubt that the siege took months and carried a heavy cost. A commander who had been raised in camps knew the burden such an operation placed on an army. Men could grow impatient when walls did not fall. Supplies had to be maintained. Discipline had to survive the slow frustration of repeated effort. The human detail of a siege is often quieter than the language of war allows. Soldiers filled baskets with earth, carried timber, dragged equipment forward, repaired damaged works, guarded trenches, and slept near danger. Defenders watched for weak points, gathered stones, strengthened gates, rationed food, and waited for news from outside. A city under siege was not only a military position, it was a place of households, stored grain, civic leaders, fear, anger, and calculations about whether help would arrive before endurance failed. Roman envoys had already warned Hannibal not to interfere with Saguntum, according to the tradition preserved by Livy and others. The warning placed him in a familiar ancient pattern. A local action became an international test because another power had spoken over it. To withdraw would have meant accepting Roman authority in a region he believed belonged within the Barcid sphere. To continue meant transforming the siege into something larger than Iberian politics. Hannibal continued. The decision should not be reduced to youthful recklessness. Hannibal was young, but he was not inexperienced. He had grown up watching his father and Hasdrubal turn Iberia into a Carthaginian base. He knew the army's expectations, the value of prestige, and the danger of allowing a protected enemy city to stand as an example. Saguntum may have looked, from his side, less like an isolated town than like a Roman wedge placed deep inside the world his family had built. Inside Rome, the question could be framed in a very different way. A friend had been attacked. A commander already associated with the hostile Barcid house had ignored warnings. Carthaginian recovery in Iberia, once concerning in the abstract, now appeared active and dangerous. Roman politics did not require every citizen to understand the details of the Ebro Treaty. It was enough that Rome's honor and credibility seemed to be touched by Saguntum's fate. The siege ended with Saguntum's fall after months of resistance. Ancient writers tell of desperate scenes as the city neared collapse, and some details carry the heavy coloring of tragic memory. The safer historical point is that the city was taken. Its wealth fell into Carthaginian hands, and the crisis could no longer be treated as a dispute waiting for clarification. Hannibal had crossed a political threshold. Rome now had to decide whether it would answer with words, delay, or war. The spoils of Saguntum also mattered in practical terms. Treasure, supplies, captives, and goods could reward the army and strengthen Hannibal's position. Ancient warfare was not sustained by strategy alone. Soldiers expected the material fruits of success. A captured city could provide money for pay, gifts for officers, and proof to allied peoples that the commander's promises led somewhere. The fall of Saguntum was therefore both a diplomatic rupture and a military resource. Carthage, across the sea, now faced the consequences of a warlike act carried out by its most powerful commander in Iberia. The city's authorities had reason to hesitate. They knew Rome's strength, remembered the cost of the earlier war, and understood that another great conflict could be ruinous. Yet Hannibal was not an isolated adventurer with a handful of followers. He commanded the army, wealth, and prestige of the Barcid West. To disavow him would have meant weakening the very force that had rebuilt Carthaginian confidence. The Roman embassy that came to Carthage after Saguntum belongs among the memorable diplomatic scenes of antiquity. The account is shaped by Roman tradition, but its essential meaning is clear. Rome demanded satisfaction. Carthage debated responsibility, treaty obligations, and the conduct of Hannibal. At the center was a question that could not be answered only by legal memory. Would Carthage restrain the Barcid commander, or would it stand behind him and accept the danger? Livy preserves the famous image of the Roman envoy gathering his toga and saying that he carried in its folds peace and war, leaving Carthage to choose. Whether the gesture occurred exactly in that form cannot be known. It has the clean shape of a story remembered by the victors. Still, ancient diplomacy often used formal language, visible gestures, and public performance, because states needed moments in which responsibility could be seen. The scene captures the final narrowing of choice. Carthage did not surrender Hannibal or undo Saguntum's fall. Rome declared war in 218 BC, and the struggle that followed would reach far beyond the city that had begun it. The Second Punic War was not simply a quarrel over treaty wording, it was the return of a rivalry that had never truly been settled. Sicily had decided the first contest. Iberia, Italy, Africa, and the wider Mediterranean would now be drawn into the second. Hannibal had prepared for such a possibility. His power in Iberia gave him soldiers, money, and a base, but it also presented a problem. Rome expected war to be fought in familiar ways, perhaps through Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, or Africa. Hannibal chose instead to carry the war into Italy by land, through Gaul, and across the Alps. That decision would require leaving secure territory, trusting mixed forces over immense distance, and bringing danger to Rome's own network of allies. The fall of Saguntum therefore served as the hinge between preparation and movement. It confirmed Roman suspicion, committed Carthage to the Barcid course, rewarded Hannibal's army, and removed the last illusion that Iberian expansion could remain separate from the wider balance of power. A fortified city on the Spanish coast had become the doorway to a war of rivers, mountains, and Italian fields. From this point, Hannibal's life ceased to be only the story of a rising commander in the West. It became the story of a man carrying his father's unfinished quarrel toward Rome itself. Chapter 5: Across the Rivers and Mountains. Hannibal's answer to the Roman declaration of war was not to wait in Iberia for Roman armies to come to him. He chose a harder path, one that carried the war away from the Carthaginian base he had inherited and toward the Italian heart of Rome's alliance system. The decision required a commander to think across whole landscapes rather than single battlefields. Iberia, the Pyrenees, southern Gaul, the Rhone, the Alps, and the plains of northern Italy became parts of one long movement. The army that left New Carthage in 218 BC was not only a fighting force, it was a moving city of soldiers, officers, servants, animals, baggage, weapons, coins, food, interpreters, and expectations. Ancient numbers vary and the exact figures are debated, but the force was large enough to alarm Rome and mixed enough to require careful handling. Iberian infantry, African troops, cavalry, slingers, and elephants all had to be moved through country that did not belong to Carthage. Hannibal was carrying more than men across distance. He was carrying the fragile order that made them one army. Before he could march north, he had to secure what he left behind. Iberia could not simply be abandoned. Garrisons, commanders, local alliances, and family authority had to remain in place because a general who moved too far from his base risked losing the source of his money and reinforcement. Hannibal placed forces under trusted leadership and left his brother Hasdrubal with responsibility in Spain. The departure was therefore not a wild leap into the unknown, but a calculated division of strength. The road north from the Carthaginian sphere led through lands where loyalty could not be assumed. Some communities submitted, some resisted, and some measured the passing army according to local advantage. An army on the march consumed the countryside around it. It needed grain, livestock, fodder, water, wood, and space to camp. Even when a commander paid or negotiated, thousands of armed men moving through a region brought pressure with them. Promises, gifts, threats, and speed became parts of the same method. Crossing the Ebro marked the first great stage of the campaign. The river was not merely water running across a map. It was a political boundary associated with the earlier agreement between Rome and Hasdrubal. Once Hannibal moved beyond it, he was operating in a space where Roman concern could only deepen. He had already forced the war through Saguntum. Now he was placing his army on a path that made retreat increasingly difficult and made boldness almost necessary. The tribes and fortified settlements north of the Ebro did not all welcome him. Hannibal had to fight in parts of northeastern Iberia and reduce opposition before reaching the Pyrenees. These operations cost time and men, but they also protected his line of movement. A hostile stronghold left behind could threaten messengers, supplies, and the confidence of allies. Ancient campaigns were often slowed not by great battles alone, but by the need to make roads safe enough for the next day's march. At the Pyrenees, another kind of difficulty appeared. Mountains do not need to be the highest in the world to trouble an army. Narrow tracks, rough slopes, uncertain weather, and local resistance could divide columns and exhaust animals. Soldiers who had followed Hannibal from familiar parts of Iberia now faced the knowledge that the campaign was not turning back towards Spain. Some men deserted or were dismissed, and the army that emerged beyond the mountains was smaller than the one that had begun the march. Hannibal seems to have understood that a reluctant soldier could become more dangerous than an absent one. Allowing or ordering some men to return may have reduced numbers, but it also hardened the force that remained. Those who continued into Gaul knew more clearly what the campaign required. In a long expedition, morale was not maintained only by speeches. It was maintained by the removal of uncertainty, the rhythm of movement, confidence in command, and the belief that the commander saw the road ahead more clearly than the men beneath him. Gaul presented a different political landscape from Iberia. Its peoples were divided among many communities, chiefs, and rival interests. Some had reason to oppose Rome, others had reason to fear any large foreign army. Hannibal needed passage, supplies, guides, and enough local cooperation to avoid being swallowed by delay. He used diplomacy where he could, force where he had to, and gifts where they would open a road more cheaply than battle. The march through southern Gaul was a lesson in the material side of ancient strategy. Food could not be conjured from courage. Herd animals had to be driven, grain collected, packs repaired, and camps set before darkness. Men's sandals wore out. Horses lost condition. Elephants required attention, space, and feed that could not always be found easily. A commander planning for Italy had to think about every river crossing and every market town on the way, because distance could defeat an army before an enemy touched it. The Rhone River became one of the most important obstacles of the march. It was broad, swift, and watched by local peoples who understood that the Carthaginians could not reach Italy without crossing it. Boats had to be gathered or built. Rafts and floats had to be prepared. Men who were used to solid ground had to trust timber, rope, hides, and the judgment of officers. The crossing of a river by an army is rarely a single moment. It is a sequence of labor, noise, waiting, fear, and discipline. Ancient accounts preserve the problem of moving the elephants across the Rhone, and the details differ in their telling. The general picture is plausible enough. These animals, valuable and difficult to replace, could not simply be ordered like infantry into deep water. Platforms, rafts, earth-covered structures, or other devices were used to persuade and carry them across. Handlers had to keep them calm, soldiers had to make room, and officers had to prevent confusion from spreading among men and animals together. A frightened elephant could endanger its own army as surely as an enemy could. Roman forces were also in motion. Publius Cornelius Scipio had sailed toward Massalia, modern Marseille, expecting to confront Hannibal before he reached Italy. The timing created one of the quiet turning points of the campaign. By the time Roman plans were adjusting to his presence in Gaul, Hannibal had already crossed the Rhone and was moving away from the coast. He did not seek the kind of battle that would trap him far from his purpose. His goal was not to defeat one Roman force in Gaul. It was to arrive in Italy before Rome could make that arrival impossible. This choice reveals the steadiness beneath the boldness of the march. Hannibal was daring, but he was not merely chasing danger. A battle near the Rhone might have produced victory, but it could also have cost men, delayed the expedition, and left the Alps still ahead. The Italian campaign depended on timing as well as courage. He needed to appear among Rome's northern neighbors before the Republic could organize the war entirely on its own terms. As the army approached the Alps, the campaign entered a harsher scale of difficulty. The exact pass Hannibal used has been debated for centuries, and certainty remains elusive. Ancient writers give descriptions of steep paths, hostile tribes, snow, rock, and narrow ledges, but the geography does not yield a single uncontested answer. What matters historically is less the modern naming of the pass than the fact that an army with cavalry and elephants crossed from Gaul into Italy through terrain that tested every part of its organization. The Alps were not empty wilderness. Communities lived among the valleys, controlled routes, and understood where an army was vulnerable. Some groups negotiated with Hannibal, offering guides or supplies. Others attacked when the Carthaginian columns stretched along narrow roads or struggled through difficult ground. Mountain warfare favored those who knew the paths. A stone rolled from above, an ambush near a defile, or a false promise from guides could do damage beyond the size of the force involved. The column itself must have been difficult to manage. Infantry, cavalry, baggage animals, elephants, camp followers, and local guides could not all move at the same pace. A narrow track might allow only a few men abreast. If the front halted, the rear could compress into confusion. If the rear lagged, the army could become dangerously divided. Officers had to pass orders along a stretched line where sound, weather, and terrain worked against clarity. Discipline in such a place was not parade ground order, but the ability to keep moving without falling apart. Cold and exhaustion added their own pressure. Many soldiers came from climates and regions far gentler than the high alpine passages. Clothing, blankets, shelters, and fires mattered. So did confidence. Men who had followed Hannibal across rivers and foreign lands now faced paths where animals slipped, loads broke loose, and the horizon seemed to offer only more stone. The ancient accounts emphasized snow partly because it represented more than weather. It was the visible sign that the army had entered a world outside ordinary campaigning. One of the best known traditions describes Hannibal pointing out Italy to his men from the heights, showing them the land that would be their prize. Whether the scene occurred exactly as later writers shaped it is uncertain, but the idea belongs naturally to the campaign. Men who had endured the ascent needed to believe that the suffering had direction. To see the plains below, or to be told that they lay near, could turn hardship back into purpose. In long marches, morale often depends on the promise that the next landscape will justify the last one. The descent may have been worse than the climb. Going down with tired men and weakened animals could break order more easily than going up. Paths damaged by weather or local obstruction had to be repaired. Loads had to be controlled. Injured men slowed companions, and animals that stumbled could block movement behind them. Ancient accounts tell of cutting through rock or repairing the way, and even if some details grew in the telling, the practical problem is clear. An army cannot descend a mountain by courage alone. It must make a road where the road fails. By the time Hannibal reached the plains of northern Italy, his army had been greatly reduced. The exact losses remain uncertain, but no ancient source treats the march as anything other than costly. Men had died, deserted, or been left behind. Animals had been lost. The survivors were worn by hunger, cold, and effort. Yet the essential fact remained. Hannibal had done what Rome had not expected him to do. He had brought a Carthaginian army into Italy by land. Northern Italy offered opportunity as well as danger. The Gallic peoples of the Po Valley had their own grievances against Rome, whose expansion had pressed into their lands. Hannibal's arrival gave them a possible ally and gave him the reinforcements and food he urgently needed. The crossing of the Alps had not been an end in itself. It was the price paid to reach a region where Rome's control was still contested, and where a foreign commander could hope to turn local resentment into military strength. The march from Iberia to Italy became one of the most remembered movements in ancient history because it joined imagination to logistics. Elephants in mountain snow, soldiers on narrow paths, a general leading men through lands that seemed to resist him. These images endured for good reason. Yet the deeper achievement lay in preparation, discipline, negotiation, and the ability to keep an army coherent across months of strain. Hannibal had not simply crossed mountains. He had carried a war from one end of the western Mediterranean to the doorstep of Rome's own alliance system. Chapter 6: The First Roman Armies Fall. Hannibal entered northern Italy with an army that had survived the impossible, but had not yet proved itself on Italian ground. The passage through the Alps had brought him fame, but fame did not feed soldiers, replace horses, or secure allies. His men were exhausted, reduced in number, and in need of rest, food, clothing, and confidence. The Po Valley, wide and fertile beneath the mountains, offered what the high passes had denied, but it also placed him within reach of Roman arms. The region was not securely settled in Rome's favor. Gallic peoples of northern Italy, especially the Boii and Insubres, had reasons to resent Roman expansion, Roman colonies, and the pressure of roads and land settlement. Only a few years earlier, Rome had fought hard to bring parts of the region under control. Hannibal's arrival gave these communities a living alternative to submission. Yet he still had to show them that he was more than a foreign commander with a battered army. The first need was recovery. Soldiers who had crossed the mountains required food and shelter before they could become useful again. Horses needed fodder and rest. Weapons and harness had to be repaired after rain, cold, rock, and long wear. Men who had lost companions in the passes needed signs that the suffering had not been wasted. In such moments, a commander's authority rested not only on discipline, but on his ability to turn survival into renewed purpose. Hannibal moved carefully among the local peoples, using both persuasion and force. Some Gallic groups came over to him readily, seeing in him a chance to weaken Rome. Others hesitated, waiting to see whether this Carthaginian could truly stand against the Republic. A new army arriving among potential allies had to be convincing quickly. If Hannibal appeared weak, he would become a burden. If he appeared dangerous, he could become the center around which older grievances gathered. Rome, meanwhile, had not expected the war to unfold in this way. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the consul who had gone toward Massalia to intercept Hannibal in Gaul, found that the Carthaginian had already moved beyond him. Scipio sent much of his force toward Spain under his brother Gnaeus, preserving the Roman effort against the Barcid base, while he himself returned toward Italy. The decision showed Roman steadiness. Even while surprised by Hannibal's movement, Rome did not forget that Iberia remained the root of Carthaginian strength. The first encounter came near the river Ticinus, a tributary of the Po. It was not a great infantry battle, but a cavalry action, and that suited Hannibal well. His Numidian horsemen and heavier cavalry gave him a kind of flexibility that Roman commanders were still learning to measure. Cavalry could scout, harass, pursue, and decide the shape of contact before the main bodies closed. In an open plain, speed and training could matter as much as numbers. Scipio led a reconnaissance force with cavalry and light troops, expecting to test the enemy and gather information. Hannibal also advanced with mounted forces, and the two armies met in a clash that revealed the danger Rome now faced. The Roman cavalry fought with courage, but courage did not solve the tactical problem before them. Numidian riders could move lightly around the edges, while other Carthaginian cavalry pressed more directly. The Romans found themselves in a fight where their usual confidence offered little protection. The action at Ticinus wounded Scipio and shook the Roman position in northern Italy. Ancient tradition credits his young son, the future Scipio Africanus, with helping save him, though the details come through later memory and should be handled with care. What matters for the course of the war is clear. A Roman consul had met Hannibal's mounted arm and suffered defeat. The result did not destroy a Roman army, but it changed the mood of the campaign. For Hannibal, Ticinus carried value beyond the field itself. The victory encouraged Gallic support, strengthened his tired army's confidence, and showed that his cavalry could master the northern plains. Local communities watching the struggle would have understood the message. Rome could be challenged. The man who had crossed the mountains was not merely a survivor of hardship, he could win. In a region where allegiance was still unsettled, that lesson mattered as much as the casualties. Scipio withdrew toward the Trebia, where he could join the other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus. Sempronius had been operating with forces originally intended for another theater, but Hannibal's presence in Italy changed Roman priorities. The two consular armies now stood in the same region, while Hannibal's army, reinforced by Gallic recruits and encouraged by success, faced the chance to strike again. Rome was still powerful, but its commanders were being forced to respond to a war that Hannibal had shaped. The Trebia campaign unfolded in winter, a season that gave every decision a physical cost. Rivers ran cold, camps needed fuel. Men standing in formation before dawn felt hunger and weather before they ever met an enemy. The plain near the river did not simply provide a stage for tactics. It shaped them through mud, frost, water, visibility, and fatigue. Hannibal had long understood that armies could be weakened before the first spear was thrown. Sempronius was eager for battle. His colleague Scipio, still affected by the earlier wound and perhaps more cautious after Ticinus, favored delay. Roman command in the Republic often carried this kind of tension because consuls held equal authority and served within the pressure of limited terms, public expectation, and personal reputation. A commander who waited might preserve an army, but he also risked appearing timid. Hannibal could use that pressure because political impatience was as real a factor as terrain. Before the battle, Hannibal prepared one of the careful arrangements that marked his command. He placed a force under his brother Mago in concealment, hidden near the battlefield in a watercourse or low ground where it could strike when the Romans were engaged. This was not a decorative trick added to a simple fight. It required knowledge of the ground, discipline among the hidden troops, and timing precise enough that concealment did not become useless waiting. The trap had to remain quiet until the larger battle drew Roman attention away. The morning began with provocation. Hannibal sent Numidian cavalry across the Trebia to harass the Roman camp and draw Sempronius out. The Romans came forward before they had eaten properly, crossing the cold river in pursuit of an enemy who knew exactly what he was inviting them to do. Water chilled the body and loosened order. Hunger and cold lowered strength quietly, without the dignity of wounds. By the time the Romans formed for battle, their discipline remained, but their bodies had already paid a price. Hannibal's men had prepared differently. According to the ancient accounts, they had eaten, warmed themselves, and oiled their bodies before the fight. Such details may seem small beside the scale of battle, but they belong to the true mechanics of command. A fed soldier in winter has an advantage over a hungry one. A commander who manages the hour before battle may shape the battle itself. Hannibal's care for these practicalities helped turn the weather into an ally. The armies met, and the Roman infantry pressed with its usual weight. Roman soldiers were not easily broken in close order, and even under poor conditions they could fight with grim steadiness. Hannibal's center, made up of mixed troops including Gauls, Iberians, and Africans, had to absorb that pressure. On the wings, however, his cavalry and elephants helped disrupt the Roman sides. The battle did not depend on one stroke alone. It depended on pressure gathering from several directions until Roman order could no longer hold. Mago's hidden detachment then struck from the rear. The effect was not merely physical, though it killed and scattered men. It changed the meaning of the battlefield. Troops who believed the danger stood before them now found it behind them as well. Commands became harder to hear, formations harder to preserve, retreat harder to imagine. The Roman army had crossed a river into cold and hunger, fought under pressure on the front and wings, and then discovered that Hannibal had left part of the battle waiting unseen. A portion of the Roman infantry fought its way through and escaped, a reminder that Trebia was not simple annihilation. Roman discipline still had depth, and some bodies of men could cut a path even through defeat. Yet the larger result was clear. Sempronius had been drawn into the kind of fight Hannibal wanted. The Roman army suffered severely, and Hannibal's position in northern Italy strengthened again. After Ticinus and Trebia, the invasion could no longer be dismissed as a daring raid. The victories also changed Hannibal's relationship with the Gallic peoples around him. Success attracted support, and support brought food, manpower, intelligence, and local knowledge. Gauls who had watched Rome's advance now saw Roman armies stumble. Hannibal could recruit more confidently among them, though he also had to manage the volatility of allies whose enthusiasm depended on visible strength. The commander who had crossed the Alps with a diminished army now began to rebuild himself in the very region Rome had hoped to secure. Rome absorbed the news with alarm, but not surrender. The Republic had lost battles before, and its political habits did not encourage quick negotiation after a single reverse. Still, these early defeats mattered because they revealed a new kind of enemy. Hannibal did not simply meet Roman armies head-on and trust to bravery. He studied commanders, weather, terrain, cavalry, morale, and the expectations of Roman public life. He made the Roman army fight while already disadvantaged, then tightened the disadvantaged until courage could no longer repair it. The first Roman armies had fallen not because Rome lacked brave soldiers, but because Hannibal had entered Italy with a fuller understanding of how to use circumstance. At Ticinus, cavalry and speed gave him the advantage. At Trebia, cold, hunger, provocation, hidden troops, and timing worked together. These victories gave his men belief, drew allies toward him, and opened the next stage of the war. Rome now faced a commander who could turn a riverbank, a winter morning, and a consul's impatience into instruments of defeat. Chapter 7, Lake Trasimene. The winter victories at Ticinus and Trebia gave Hannibal more than confidence. They gave him time, allies, and a position from which he could begin shaping the Italian war on terms Rome had not chosen. Northern Italy had opened to him through Gallic support, and his army, though still mixed and dependent on movement, was no longer the exhausted force that had descended from the Alps. Men who had crossed rivers, mountains, and winter fields now carried the memory of Roman defeat with them. Rome did not respond by yielding the Po Valley in spirit. New consuls were elected for 217 BC, and the Republic prepared to continue the war with the stubbornness that would become one of its defining strengths. The names now at the center were Gaius Flaminius and Gnaeus Servilius Geminus. Each held consular authority. Each commanded forces raised from Rome and its allies, and each faced a problem unlike the wars to which Roman habits were best suited. Hannibal was not waiting where a Roman army wished to find him. Gaius Flaminius was a man with a strong public profile. He had earlier supported measures associated with land distribution in northern Italy and had commanded against Gallic peoples. His political life had made him popular with many ordinary citizens and suspect among some of the senatorial elite. Roman sources, especially those shaped by later aristocratic memory, often present him as rash, impious, and headstrong. That portrait must be read carefully, because defeat has a way of making a commander's flaws seem inevitable. Yet Flaminius did move with urgency. He had reason to do so. Hannibal's army was not simply standing in a distant corner of the peninsula. It threatened the land, allies, roads, and confidence on which Roman power rested. A consul who allowed the invader to move freely through Italy risked criticism from every direction. Delay might be prudent in one sense, but politically dangerous in another. Roman commanders served for short terms, under public attention, with honor and blame close beside them. Hannibal understood this pressure. He had already drawn Sempronius into battle at Trebia by using provocation, weather, and impatience. The same wider habit guided him now, though the geography changed. Rather than remaining in the north and waiting for Roman forces to combine neatly against him, he moved southward, seeking to pass through difficult country and appear where Roman planning did not expect him. Movement itself became a weapon, because every mile forced Rome to guess where he would strike next. His route carried the army through the Apennines and into Etruria, after a passage through marshy ground that ancient writers remembered as punishing. The march through the low, wet country near the Arno was hard on men and animals. Water, mud, sickness, and exhaustion could weaken an army as surely as enemy weapons. Hannibal himself is said to have suffered an illness that cost him the sight of one eye, though the details are uncertain. The story fits the larger truth that even a victorious commander could not pass through Italy untouched by its physical demands. The army that emerged into Etruria did what invading armies often did when they needed to draw attention. It ravaged land, gathered supplies, and made itself impossible to ignore. Farms, fields, stores of grain, herds, and rural property became part of the war. Such devastation was not only cruelty or hunger, though it could be both. It was a message to allies and enemies alike. Rome's protection was being tested in the sight of the people who depended on it. Flaminius followed. His army moved after Hannibal through a landscape where urgency could blur caution. A commander pursuing an enemy who is destroying allied land may feel that every delay costs reputation, loyalty, and public trust. Hannibal's force, meanwhile, did not flee aimlessly. It moved with enough control to choose ground. The difference between pursuit and entrapment often lay in who understood the road better and who could think beyond the next march. Lake Trasimene lay in a basin of hills and water, a place where road, slope, and shoreline could narrow the possibilities of movement. The ancient shoreline and exact battlefield conditions have been debated as landscapes change over centuries, but the broad setting is clear enough. A road passed near the lake, with higher ground nearby and spaces where troops could be concealed. For an army marching in column, the place held danger if the enemy already occupied the heights. Hannibal prepared an ambush there in 217 BC, arranging his troops so that the Romans would enter a killing ground before they understood the shape of the danger. This required patience and control from an army made of many peoples. Men had to remain hidden or quiet in assigned positions. Units had to wait until the moment came, not reveal themselves early, and trust that the column below would pass far enough into the trap. Ambush, at this scale, was not disorder. It was discipline held in silence. The morning gave Hannibal another advantage. Ancient accounts describe mist or fog around the lake, the kind of weather that could soften distances and hide movement. Whether every detail is exact or heightened by memory, reduced visibility suits the known nature of the battle. A marching army depends on sight, sound, and the orderly passage of information along its column. In fog, a commander sees less, hears confusion sooner, and learns too late what the front or rear has encountered. Flaminius entered the area with his army stretched along the road. Roman soldiers on the march did not move as they fought in formal line. They moved in order, but extended by the requirements of terrain, baggage, and column movement. Shields, packs, standards, officers, animals, and files of men passed along a route that left little room for quick deployment. If attacked before forming properly, even disciplined troops could be forced to fight in fragments. Hannibal waited until the Romans were committed. Then his forces came down from the heights and closed upon the column. The Carthaginian army attacked from prepared positions, and the Romans found themselves pressed between the lake, the hills, and enemies who had chosen the hour. It was not a battle in the usual Roman sense, where legions could form, advance, and trust their structure. It was a sudden struggle to understand where danger was coming from. The human experience of such a battle was one of broken information. A soldier in one part of the column might hear shouting before seeing anything. Another might find men ahead halted while those behind continued to press forward. Officers tried to form ranks where the ground allowed, but the shape of the place had already worked against them. Standards that normally gave direction could become hard to locate. Orders traveled poorly when fear and noise filled the road. Flaminius was killed in the fighting. Later Roman memory placed weight on his death, and the tradition named a Gallic warrior as the man who struck him down. The exact moment cannot be recovered with confidence, but the effect was plain. A consul had fallen, and his army was being destroyed in a place where command had little room to repair the situation. In Roman political life, the death of a consul in battle was not only a military loss, it was an injury to the dignity and order of the republic. The scale of the defeat was severe. Many Romans were killed near the lake, others were captured, and those who escaped did so from a catastrophe rather than an orderly withdrawal. A separate Roman force under Gaius Centenius, sent with cavalry or troops to support the campaign, was also defeated by Hannibal's cavalry soon after, deepening the blow. The Carthaginian commander had not merely won a battle, he had prevented the Romans from stabilizing the theater after Trebia. For Hannibal, Lake Trasimene confirmed the qualities that made him dangerous. He could read a commander's temperament, choose ground, use weather and terrain, and demand patience from a mixed army. He did not need numerical certainty if the shape of the encounter was his own. A Roman army was strongest when formed, ordered, and allowed to apply its discipline in full. At Trasimene, Hannibal denied it the conditions in which that strength could best appear. The aftermath also showed his political awareness. Hannibal treated Roman and allied prisoners differently, according to accounts preserved by ancient writers. Roman citizens were held, but many Italian allies were released without ransom. The gesture had a purpose. He wanted the peoples bound to Rome to see him not as their natural enemy, but as the enemy of Roman domination. Every released prisoner could carry that message home along roads, through villages, and into local councils. The policy was subtle because Hannibal's campaign depended on more than victories. He had not invaded Italy simply to kill Roman soldiers. He needed Rome's allies to reconsider their loyalty. The Republic's strength lay not only in the city itself, but in the network of Latin colonies, allied communities, obligations, treaties, and shared military burdens that fed its armies year after year. Hannibal's victories would matter most if they loosened that network. Trasimene gave him another chance to test it. News of the disaster reached Rome with a force that can still be sensed through the sources. A consul dead, an army lost, Hannibal loose in Italy. These were facts that entered households as well as public offices. Families waited for names. Magistrates had to manage fear. The Senate had to consider not only the next army, but the religious and civic meaning of repeated defeat. In the ancient city, military disaster often demanded ritual response as well as strategic planning. The Republic now turned toward an older emergency measure. Quintus Fabius Maximus would be appointed dictator, given extraordinary authority to meet the crisis. His approach would differ sharply from the pursuit that had ended at Lake Trasimene. Rome had learned, at terrible cost, that Hannibal could not be handled as an ordinary invader seeking ordinary battle. A new kind of patience would have to answer the Carthaginians' talent for movement, provocation, and prepared ground. Lake Trasimene remained one of the great ambushes of ancient warfare, because it showed Hannibal's command at a high and unsettling level. He had crossed into Italy by a route few expected, drawn Roman armies into unfavorable contact, and now destroyed a consular force beside a lake before it could properly become itself in battle. Yet the victory also deepened the central problem of his war. Rome was frightened, wounded, and grieving, but still intact. The road beyond Trasimene led not to surrender, but to a slower contest over whether Rome could learn how not to be beaten in the way Hannibal wished. Chapter 8: Fabius and the War of Patience. After Lake Trasimene, Rome faced a problem deeper than the loss of another army. Hannibal had now defeated Roman forces in different ways, under different commanders, and in different landscapes. He had used cavalry on the plains, winter hardship beside the Trebia, and concealment beside Lake Trasimene. The Republic could still raise soldiers, appoint magistrates, and call upon allies, but it needed a way to prevent Hannibal from choosing the conditions of every encounter. The man chosen for this task was Quintus Fabius Maximus. He came from one of Rome's old patrician families, a world of names, offices, ancestral expectation, and public dignity. His appointment as dictator gave him extraordinary authority, though even a dictator in Rome operated inside a culture that watched, judged, and remembered. The office itself belonged to emergency. It told the city that ordinary command had not been enough, and that the crisis required a steadier hand than the yearly consulship had provided. Fabius did not try to erase the shock of Trasimene with immediate revenge. His answer was restraint. He followed Hannibal, observed him, blocked him when possible, denied him easy supplies, and refused battle on ground chosen by the Carthaginian commander. This method would later be associated so strongly with him that patience itself became Fabian. At the time, it could look less like wisdom than fear, especially to men who believed Roman honor required visible action. The Roman expectation of command was not built around avoidance. A consul or dictator was supposed to defend allies, punish invaders, restore confidence, and bring the enemy to battle when the gods and circumstances allowed. Men who had lost farms to raiding could not always admire caution from a distance. Senators with wounded family pride wanted proof that Rome could still strike. Soldiers, trained to think of courage as public virtue, could resent a policy that kept them marching near the enemy without closing. Fabius understood that Hannibal wanted another Roman army to hurry into disadvantage. The pattern had become clear enough. Hannibal did not merely wait for battle, he arranged it. He used the impatience of others as a material resource, no less real than cavalry or grain. A commander who pursued him angrily risked becoming part of the Carthaginian plan. Fabius's first achievement was to see that refusing Hannibal could be a form of fighting him. The mechanics of this policy were harder than the phrase suggests. Fabius had to keep his army close enough to watch Hannibal, but not so close that it could be trapped. He used high ground, careful camps, guarded routes, and controlled movement. Scouts mattered. Local intelligence mattered. The choice of where to pitch a camp could decide whether soldiers rested securely or woke to a sudden alarm. Patience was not idleness, it was discipline stretched over days and weeks. Hannibal moved through Italy with the burden of an invader who needed the land to sustain him. His army required food, fodder, shelter, animals, and opportunities to gather support from Rome's allies. A city defending its own territory can draw upon familiar networks, but a foreign army must keep moving or create its own arrangements by force and negotiation. Fabius tried to make every movement less profitable. If Hannibal could not easily fight a decisive battle and could not easily break Rome's alliances, his victories would begin to lose some of their force. The countryside carried the cost of this contest. Fields could be burned or stripped, herds driven away, granaries emptied, and farmhouses abandoned as armies approached. The war was not only decided by consular decisions and senatorial debates, it entered rural households through lost oxen, trampled vines, broken storage jars, missing tools, and the uncertainty of planting when soldiers might arrive before harvest. Fabius' strategy protected Rome's army, but it could not protect every field. Hannibal recognized the political weakness inside Fabian caution. An invader who ravaged land in front of a Roman army could make that army look passive. If allies saw their farms destroyed while Roman troops watched from safer ground, loyalty might begin to loosen. Hannibal needed such doubts. He had entered Italy not simply to defeat legions, but to persuade Rome's allied communities that the Republic could no longer defend them. Fabius had to preserve the army without allowing the alliance system to lose faith. A famous episode from this phase shows the contest of minds between the two commanders. Hannibal was moving through difficult country when Fabius managed to hold the exits, placing the Carthaginian army in a dangerous position. The exact details vary in ancient accounts, but the tradition centers on the Ager Falernus, a fertile district whose roads and passes could trap an army if carefully guarded. For a moment, the patient Romans seem to have turned caution into enclosure. Hannibal escaped by a stratagem that ancient writers remembered vividly. He had bundles of brushwood tied to the horns of cattle, set them alight at night, and drove the animals toward the heights. Roman guards, seeing moving flames in the darkness, believed the Carthaginian army was attempting a passage there. Confusion opened the way for Hannibal's real movement, and the trapped army slipped out. The story carries the clean shape of a military miniature, but it also reflects a practical truth. Hannibal knew how to turn fear, darkness, and animal movement into misdirection. For Fabius, the episode was embarrassing but not ruinous. His larger method remained intact because his aim had never been to win the war with a single clever enclosure. He wanted to prevent Hannibal from winning it with another Roman disaster. In that sense, even failure could be absorbed if the army survived. This was one of the hardest lessons Rome had to learn. Against Hannibal, survival itself could be an achievement. The public mood in Rome did not easily accept that lesson. Fabius gained the mocking nickname Cunctator, the delayer, though later generations would give that same title a tone of respect. At the time, delay seemed to many like a refusal to use Roman strength. The master of horse, Marcus Minucius Rufus, became a focus for dissatisfaction. He favored a more aggressive line, and his successes in smaller actions encouraged those who believed Fabius's caution had gone too far. Roman politics then did something unusual and revealing. Minucius was granted equal authority with Fabius, dividing command in a way that weakened the dictator's control. This was not a small administrative adjustment. It showed how military policy, public emotion, and political rivalry could reshape command even during an emergency. Rome's institutions were strong, but they were not free from pressure. Citizens and senators wanted action, and Minucius appeared to offer it. The divided command soon brought danger. Minucius, more willing to engage Hannibal, was drawn into a difficult position. Hannibal arranged the ground and concealed troops in a manner that recalls the habits seen before. He understood that an aggressive Roman commander, newly elevated and eager to justify trust, could be led toward risk. Once again, the Carthaginian method did not depend on strength alone. It depended on reading the man across from him. Fabius intervened and rescued Minucius from serious defeat. The episode allowed later Roman memory to give the delayer a kind of quiet vindication. Minucius is said to have acknowledged Fabius's superior judgment, even calling him father in gratitude according to the moralized tradition. The exact words may belong to Roman storytelling, but the movement of the event is credible. A policy mocked as cowardice had preserved the army and saved the more aggressive officer from Hannibal's design. The year of Fabius did not destroy Hannibal. It did not drive him from Italy, restore every ally's confidence, or erase the shame of earlier defeats. Its value lay in something less visible. It gave Rome time to breathe. Armies could be raised, losses counted, rituals performed, magistrates replaced, and political thought adjusted to the enemy now before them. The Republic had begun to learn that Hannibal's brilliance was most dangerous when Rome gave him the battle he wanted. For Hannibal, Fabian delay created frustration. His army still needed supplies, still needed allies to defect, and still needed the war to become politically unbearable for Rome. Each month without decisive Roman collapse placed more strain on his position. He could move, raid, and threaten, but movement alone did not conquer a republic whose allies mostly remained bound to it. The war was becoming a contest not only of armies, but of endurance between an invader and a political system. There was another quiet asymmetry at work. Rome could lose a battle and raise another army from citizens and allies. Hannibal could win a battle and still struggle to replace the exact men, horses, and officers lost in victory. His army was experienced and formidable, but it was far from Carthage and dependent on uncertain reinforcements. Fabian's strategy pressed on that weakness by refusing to trade Rome's depth for Hannibal's tactical advantage. Yet Rome's patience was not endless. The pressure of ravaged land, wounded pride, and political impatience continued to build. Many Romans still believed that the Republic could and should settle the matter in open battle, with a larger force and more determined command. Fabius had shown how not to be destroyed by Hannibal, but he had not satisfied the desire to defeat him. The distinction would lead Rome toward a new and far more dangerous decision. The War of Patience therefore stands as a pause that was not truly calm. Behind Fabius's restraint lay burned farms, anxious allies, angry debates, cautious marches, and a commander refusing to let the enemy govern his mind. Behind Hannibal's movements lay the need to provoke, feed, persuade, and unsettle a republic that would not yet break. The two men did not give history a great battlefield in this phase, but they revealed the shape of the larger struggle. Hannibal could win by forcing Rome to hurry, while Rome could survive by learning for a time to wait. Chapter 9, Cannae. The impatience that Fabius had resisted did not disappear when his dictatorship ended. Rome had endured the year of delay, watched Hannibal move through Italy, and preserved its armies from another Trasimene. But many citizens and leaders still wanted a more direct answer. An invader remained on Italian soil, feeding from the land, speaking to allies, and proving with each season that Rome could not easily force him out. Patience had kept the Republic from disaster, yet it had not restored Roman confidence. For 216 BC, Rome prepared a force of unusual size. The consuls were Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, two men remembered through traditions colored by later blame and admiration. Paulus was associated with aristocratic caution, Varro with popular energy, though the neat contrast should not be accepted too simply. Roman memory often arranged defeated commanders into moral patterns. Still, the political pressure behind their command was real. Rome intended to bring Hannibal to battle with overwhelming strength. The army gathered from citizens and allies represented the depth of Rome's military system. Legions were raised, allied contingents summoned, officers appointed, supplies organized, standards prepared, and the machinery of consular command set in motion. Every levy touched households. Men left farms, workshops, and family obligations. Allied communities sent their required numbers, carts, animals, grain, weapons, and servants followed the armed columns. A large Roman army was not only a military answer, it was the Republic turning its social body toward war. Hannibal had positioned himself in Apulia, in southeastern Italy, where the open country offered room for cavalry and movement. He seized the supply depot at Cannae near the Aufidus River, a site useful because it touched Rome's arrangements for feeding its forces. By taking it, he forced Roman attention upon him. The place itself was not a grand city whose capture would decide the war, but a practical point of grain, road, and pressure. In ancient warfare, a storehouse could be as meaningful as a fortress. The landscape around Cannae suited a commander who trusted cavalry and timing. The Aufidus wound through open ground, and the summer air of Apulia could bring heat, dust, and discomfort to men packed in dense formation. Armies did not fight in an empty abstraction. Wind, sun, river, slope, distance from camp, access to water, and the direction of dust all belong to the field. Hannibal had spent years learning how to place ordinary conditions in the service of command. The Roman consuls faced a divided inheritance of advice. Fabius' caution remained recent, but so did the frustration it had caused. A massive army seemed to promise an end to the humiliation of being followed, teased, and provoked by a smaller invader. Rome's infantry was its pride, and Roman confidence in close order fighting had deep roots. If Hannibal could be pinned before the weight of the legions, many believed his long movement through Italy might finally meet its limit. Ancient accounts preserve disagreement between Paulus and Varro over whether to fight, though the details are shaped by later judgment. The consuls alternated command by day according to Roman practice, and this arrangement could be awkward when strategy required continuous judgment. Equal authority was a safeguard in civic life, but on campaign it could produce unstable direction. Hannibal did not need to control Roman institutions. He needed only to understand where their habits created openings. On the day of battle, traditionally dated to 2 August 216 BC, the Roman army formed with unusual depth. The infantry mass was compressed more heavily than usual, with the intention of breaking through Hannibal's center by sheer pressure. Cavalry stood on the wings, Roman horse on one side and allied cavalry on the other. The plan carried a certain logic. If the Roman center crushed the Carthaginian middle quickly enough, the battle could be decided before Hannibal's cavalry superiority fully shaped events. Hannibal arranged his line with care. His weaker or more flexible center, made up largely of Gauls and Iberians, curved outward toward the Romans. African infantry stood farther back on the wings, held in positions that would become decisive only after the Roman advance drew forward. His cavalry, especially under commanders such as Hasdrubal and Maharbal in the tradition, occupied the wings where speed and aggression could be used. Nothing in the arrangement was accidental. The center was not placed simply to resist, it was placed to yield. The first movement of the battle drew the Romans inward. Their dense infantry advanced against the protruding Carthaginian center, driving it back. To Roman soldiers in the front ranks, this may have felt like success. The enemy line bent. Men pushed forward, shields close, bodies packed behind them, the pressure of thousands moving in one direction. Yet the very success narrowed their freedom. The deeper they pressed, the more the Roman formation crowded into the space Hannibal had prepared. The Carthaginian center gave ground without dissolving. This required remarkable control from men who might easily have broken under the weight of the Roman push. Gauls and Iberians, often described by Roman writers with a mixture of admiration and condescension, carried the most dangerous burden of the plan. They had to retreat fighting, bend without collapse, and trust that the army around them would not abandon them. A feigned weakness becomes real weakness if discipline fails. On the wings, the cavalry battle moved with a different rhythm. Hannibal's horsemen defeated the Roman cavalry and then turned their attention across the field. Cavalry success mattered because it removed the Roman army's protection at its sides and rear. Once the Roman horse was driven away, the infantry mass became increasingly isolated. The legions were still formidable from the front, but they were losing the wider battle around them. The African infantry now moved inward from the sides. These troops, held back earlier, struck the Romans as the dense center continued to press forward. The shape of the battle changed slowly and then completely. What had begun as a Roman attack became an enclosure. The Carthaginian line, once curved outward, had drawn into a concave trap, with Roman soldiers crowded inside. Hannibal's army was not merely resisting the Roman advance, it was folding around it. The double envelopment at Cannae became one of the most studied tactical achievements in military history, but its human reality was not an exercise in geometry. Thousands of men found that the space around them had vanished. The front ranks could not easily stop because those behind pressed forward. The rear could not easily turn because the cavalry had closed. The sides were under attack. Commands lost their reach inside the packed formation. The very density meant to give Rome force now made movement difficult. Lucius Aemilius Paulus died in the battle, along with many officers and senators who had served with the army. Varro escaped, a fact later Roman tradition handled with a mixture of blame and official restraint. The loss of leaders mattered because Roman command depended on visible rank, standards, and the authority of men known to the soldiers. As the enclosure tightened, the fall of officers deepened the confusion and made organized recovery less possible. The casualties were immense by ancient standards, though exact numbers differ among sources. Tens of thousands of Roman and allied soldiers were killed or captured. The scale of loss reached into the Roman elite, the allied communities, and countless households whose names were not preserved. Rings taken from dead equestrians were later remembered as a symbol of the blow to Rome's leading orders. Such images endured because they gave physical shape to an otherwise overwhelming number. Hannibal's army also paid a price, especially among the Gauls in the center who had borne the heavy Roman attack. Victory did not mean the Carthaginian force was untouched. Men who had held the bending line had fallen in large numbers, and experienced soldiers could not be replaced easily so far from the original base in Iberia. Even at Cannae, the finest of Hannibal's victories, the cost of winning belonged to the calculation of what could be done next. After the battle, the question became whether Hannibal should march directly on Rome. The ancient tradition preserves the famous exchange in which Maharbal is said to have urged immediate movement and told Hannibal that he knew how to win victory, but not how to use it. The words may be sharpened by later storytelling, but the debate they represent is real enough. A battlefield triumph, however vast, still had to be turned into political collapse, and Rome was not only an army standing in a field. The city of Rome lay behind walls, manpower, institutions, allied networks, religious resolve, and the habits of a republic trained to continue after loss. Hannibal lacked siege equipment suitable for quickly taking the city, and his army, though victorious, was tired and reduced. To march on Rome without the means to capture it might have risked turning triumph into exhaustion. The road from Cannae to Rome was not simply a distance on land, it was a question of supplies, walls, allies, and time. The greater immediate opportunity lay in Italy's alliances. If enough communities abandoned Rome, Cannae could become more than a battle. It could become the beginning of Roman isolation. Hannibal released or negotiated with allied prisoners, continued his policy of distinguishing between Rome and the peoples bound to it, and waited for the political effect of disaster. Some did come over, most famously Capua later in the war, but the alliance system did not collapse all at once. Rome had been wounded beyond precedent, yet its structure remained standing. Inside Rome, the aftermath required a discipline almost as remarkable as battlefield courage. The Senate met, measures were taken, religious rites performed, and panic restrained. The city refused to ransom prisoners on Hannibal's terms, a harsh decision that signaled to citizens and allies alike that defeat would not become negotiation. Varro, despite the disaster, was reportedly thanked for not despairing of the Republic. That gesture, whether exactly as preserved or shaped by memory, captured Rome's effort to make endurance a public duty. Cannae was the nearest Hannibal came to breaking Rome by battle. He had drawn the largest Roman force yet into a field suited to his strengths, read its intention, absorbed its pressure, destroyed its cavalry, and enclosed its infantry in a design whose clarity still astonishes. Yet the day also revealed the limit of tactical perfection. A republic could lose an army and remain a republic. A commander could win one of history's most complete victories and still face the harder work of turning fear into surrender. The field near the Aufidus became, for later generations, a name almost separate from the place itself. Cannae meant disaster to Romans, mastery to students of command, and warning to anyone who believed numbers alone could solve a strategic problem. For Hannibal, it was the summit of his Italian war. Beyond it lay not easy triumph, but the long, difficult question that would define the rest of his campaign. Why a city so terribly beaten still refused to fall. Chapter 10. Why Rome Did Not Fall. Cannae should have been enough if the fate of states were decided only by the destruction of armies. Rome had lost tens of thousands of men, including senators, officers, citizens, allies, and members of families whose names carried weight inside the Republic. The battlefield beside the Aufidus had removed not merely a force in the field, but a portion of Rome's governing and military class. Yet the city did not send envoys to Hannibal asking for terms. It did not open its gates. It did not admit, even after such ruin, that the war had been decided. The first reason lay in the structure of Roman public life. Rome was not a monarchy whose spirit could collapse with the death of one ruler, nor a loose coalition whose members had only recently been gathered by fear. Its authority rested on magistrates, senate, assemblies, priesthoods, families, laws, colonies, and long habits of command. When one consul died, another office still existed. When one army was destroyed, the system that had raised it did not vanish with the men. Institutions gave grief a place to move into action. The Senate became the center of that endurance. It did not command every detail in the modern sense, but it preserved continuity across yearly magistracies and personal losses. Senators could debate, assign tasks, manage finances, consult religious authorities, and hold together the dignity of government when panic would have been natural. Many of them had lost relatives at Cannae. Some had lost sons, brothers, clients, or political allies. Still, the body remained, and its remaining members acted as if Rome's future had to be administered before it could be mourned. One of the most important gestures after Cannae was the refusal to negotiate for peace. Hannibal sent envoys, and the possibility of ransom or settlement entered the political air, but Rome chose severity. Prisoners taken in battle were not redeemed on the terms Hannibal offered. This decision was harsh for the men in captivity and for the families who hoped to recover them. It also carried a public message. Surrender would not be allowed to grow from private grief. The decision not to ransom prisoners reveals something difficult about Roman resilience. The Republic could be merciless toward its own pain when public policy required it. Families might long for husbands and sons, but the Senate feared that negotiation would teach Hannibal that Roman loss could be converted into political leverage. A state that paid heavily for captured soldiers after the worst defeat in its memory might appear ready for larger concessions. Rome answered by making endurance more important than rescue. The city also worked to control fear. Ancient accounts describe measures to limit public mourning, manage gatherings, and prevent despair from spreading through the streets. Such details should not be read as the absence of sorrow. They show the opposite. Grief was so widespread that it had to be governed. Women, households, clients, dependents, and neighbors all felt the losses. In a city where public reputation mattered, mourning itself became part of civic order. Religion belonged naturally to this response. Roman public life joined military events to divine favor, ritual fault, vows, prodigies, and expiation. After disasters, priests and magistrates did not treat defeat as a purely tactical matter. They consulted sacred procedures, performed rites, and sought to restore the relationship between city and gods. To modernize, this may seem separate from strategy, but for Rome it helped turn panic into recognizable action. Ritual gave the community a way to answer what could not be repaired by raising troops alone. The manpower question was severe, but not hopeless. Rome's strength lay in its ability to draw soldiers from a broad citizen body and from allied communities across Italy. The system was painful and demanding, yet it gave the Republic a depth that Hannibal could not easily exhaust in one battle. New levies could be raised, younger and older men considered, emergency measures taken, and units rebuilt. Every new army cost more households their labor and safety, but the machinery still functioned. Rome's allies were the greater question. Hannibal understood that the Republic could not be broken only by killing Romans. It had to be separated from the Italian communities whose manpower, supplies, and loyalty made Roman warfare possible. After Cannae, he released many Allied prisoners without ransom, hoping they would carry home the message that he fought Rome, not Italy. This was a shrewd policy. It recognized that Rome's power lived in treaties, obligations, roads, colonies, and local elites as much as in the city itself. Some communities did defect. Capua, one of the richest and most important cities in Italy, eventually joined Hannibal. Several peoples in southern Italy reconsidered their position, and the war opened spaces where old resentments against Roman power could be expressed. These defections mattered greatly. They gave Hannibal food, prestige, bases, and political hope. Yet they did not amount to the general collapse he needed. Many allies remained with Rome, even under terrible pressure. The reasons for Allied loyalty were not simple affection. Roman power had been woven into Italy through settlement, legal arrangements, hostages in some contexts, local aristocratic interests, trade, intermarriage, military habits, and fear of punishment. Latin colonies stood as strong points of Roman influence. Local elites often had much to lose if the Roman system disappeared and a new Carthaginian-backed order replaced it. For many communities, loyalty may have been a calculation of risk rather than devotion. Hannibal's position after Cannae therefore contained a quiet weakness. He had won the kind of battle commanders dream of winning, but he lacked the instruments to make every Italian ally obey his victory. He could reward those who came over, threaten those nearby, and win further engagements, yet he could not be everywhere. An allied town deciding whether to defect had to ask not only whether Hannibal was brilliant, but whether he would still be there when Roman armies returned. Rome's colonies played a special role in this endurance. They were not merely settlements of farmers placed on distant land. They were military and political anchors, binding territory to Rome by population, law, and interest. A colony could guard roads, resist enemies, supply troops, and remind neighboring peoples that Roman authority was not only a distant senate, but a local presence. Hannibal could move through Italy, but he moved through a landscape already marked by Roman institutions. The city itself remained difficult to attack. Rome had walls, a large population, religious confidence, political organization, and the ability to draw defenders into a concentrated space. Hannibal's army had been shaped for movement, field battle, alliance politics, and operational surprise. It was not equipped for a quick, certain siege of the capital. Without heavy siege preparations, secure supply lines, and enough allied support around the city, a march on Rome might have become a symbolic gesture rather than a decisive act. This is why the famous question of why Hannibal did not march on Rome cannot be answered by courage alone. The distance from Cannae to Rome was real, but the deeper distance was logistical and political. A city can be approached without being captured. Walls can turn an exhausted victorious army into a waiting army, and waiting requires food. If Rome refused to surrender, Hannibal would need to feed his troops, protect his rear, hold allies together, and maintain pressure while far from a secure base. Carthage did not provide the kind of support that might have changed the equation. The reasons were complex: distance, politics, competing theaters, naval limitations, caution, and the Carthaginian habit of balancing commanders rather than surrendering all policy to one family's war. Hannibal remained formidable in Italy, but he did not receive an overwhelming flood of reinforcements after Cannae. His victory had created a historic opportunity, but opportunities still require ships, men, money, animals, equipment, and political will. The contrast with Rome was sharp. Rome could make mistakes and still draw upon Italy. Hannibal could make masterpieces and still wait for support that came too slowly or not in sufficient form. His army's experience was priceless, but also fragile. Veteran infantry, skilled cavalry, trusted officers, and reliable local allies could not be replaced by proclamation. A lost Roman army could be rebuilt from institutions. A worn Carthaginian army in Italy had to be preserved like a precious instrument. The psychological force of Roman refusal should not be underestimated. After Cannae, many states in the ancient world might have treated negotiation as prudent. Rome instead converted refusal into identity. To continue became a way of proving that the Republic was more than the sum of its armies. This did not mean every Roman was fearless or united in feeling. It meant the public decisions of the state gave fear no official path toward surrender. There was also memory at work. Rome had endured hard wars before, including the long struggle with Carthage over Sicily. Its political culture honored ancestors who had accepted danger, sacrifice, and loss for the city. Such memory could be severe, even burdensome, but it gave the ruling class a language for continuing. Defeat could be fitted into older patterns of duty, divine testing, discipline, and eventual recovery. The dead at Cannae were mourned, but they were also absorbed into the story Rome told about itself. Hannibal had exposed the limits of Roman generalship, but not the limits of the Roman state. He could outthink commanders, mislead armies, and use terrain with extraordinary skill. He could make consuls fail. He could make families grieve. What he could not do after Cannae was force the Senate to treat battle as judgment. The Republic separated military disaster from political surrender, and in that separation lay the beginning of Hannibal's larger frustration. The war after Cannae therefore became a different kind of contest. Hannibal still held the initiative in parts of Italy, and Rome still feared him deeply, but the simple hope that one perfect victory would end the war had passed. Rome would avoid his strongest gifts when it could, punish defectors when possible, recover lost positions slowly, and keep raising armies despite the cost. Its survival came from institutions, allies, manpower, ritual discipline, and a harsh willingness to continue. Hannibal had almost broken Roman confidence, but he had not broken the structure that allowed Rome to act after confidence had failed. Chapter 11: The Long War in Italy. After Cannae, the war did not become a simple march toward Roman surrender. It became longer, more difficult, and in some ways more revealing. Hannibal had won the greatest battlefield victory of his life, yet victory opened a landscape of choices rather than a clear road. He had to decide where to move, which allies to cultivate, which cities to pressure, how to feed his army, and how to keep the political meaning of Cannae alive before Rome's recovery could narrow it. The center of gravity shifted toward southern Italy. There, Rome's hold was real but uneven, and older local identities remained strong beneath formal alliance. Greek cities, Oscan-speaking communities, Samnite memories, Lucanian and Bruchian interests, and aristocratic rivalries all lay under the surface of Roman power. Hannibal's presence gave many of these communities a chance to reconsider their future. Some saw liberation, some saw danger, and others waited to learn which side could protect them when the next army arrived. Capua became the most important prize of this new phase. It was one of the wealthiest cities in Italy, famous for its fertile lands, refined habits, and political weight. Its defection after Cannae gave Hannibal the kind of ally he needed: rich, prestigious, and close enough to Roman territory to make the Republic feel the loss. Capua's choice told other communities that Rome could be abandoned by a city of consequence. It also gave Hannibal a wintering place and a center from which to project influence. The decision within Capua was not made by a city speaking with one simple voice. Local elites, popular pressures, memories of Roman control, hopes of greater status, and fear of Roman punishment all shaped the debate. Hannibal offered terms that preserved Capuan dignity and suggested a future in which the city might stand high in an Italian order no longer dominated by Rome. Such promises mattered deeply. A city did not defect merely because an army camped nearby. It needed some idea of what life after Rome might look like. For Hannibal, Capua was useful but also demanding. A great allied city expected protection. Its leaders wanted reassurance. Its people needed food, and its political choice had to be defended against Roman retaliation. The moment an Italian community joined him, it became a responsibility as well as an asset. Rome did not forget defectors. Hannibal had to hold enough ground, win enough trust, and maintain enough movement to keep new allies from regretting their decision. Roman strategy after Cannae grew more careful. The Republic did not abandon battle entirely, but it avoided giving Hannibal the kind of open, decisive encounter he had mastered. Commanders watched him, shadowed him, blocked routes, recaptured towns, and struck at detachments or allies when conditions were favorable. The war became less a single contest between two armies and more a web of sieges, raids, garrisons, local betrayals, supply problems, and gradual pressure. This change placed strain on Hannibal's strengths. He remained dangerous in movement and formidable in battle, but he could not force every Roman commander to repeat the mistakes of Trebia, Trasimene, or Cannae. A city behind walls required different tools from a legion in the field. A guarded road required patience. A doubtful ally required negotiation. The brilliant battlefield commander now had to sustain a political war across a peninsula whose loyalty could shift from valley to valley. The capture and loss of towns became central to the rhythm of the conflict. Some communities opened gates to Hannibal through negotiation or internal faction. Others resisted and had to be taken by force, which consumed time and men. In many places, the question was not simply Carthage or Rome. It was which local faction could seize the moment, which families held influence, which garrison controlled the citadel, and which side seemed more likely to return with punishment. Tarentum showed both the promise and frustration of Hannibal's Italian strategy. The Greek city, wealthy and important, offered a harbor and a position of great value in southern Italy. Hannibal eventually gained entry through internal arrangement, exploiting local hostility toward Rome and the presence of young men willing to risk betrayal from within. The operation had the quiet complexity of a political capture: contacts, timing, gates, signals, and the careful separation of friends from enemies in darkness. Yet even Tarentum did not give Hannibal everything he needed. The Roman garrison retained the citadel, which controlled the harbor and prevented the city from becoming the secure maritime base he wanted. This small geographical fact carried large consequences. A city could be taken, but a strong point inside it could deny its full use. Walls within walls, harbors watched by hostile soldiers, and supply routes under threat made victory incomplete. Hannibal held the city, but Rome held the part that mattered most for receiving support by sea. The war in Italy also depended on food. Hannibal's army had to live from regions that could be exhausted, defended, or stripped in advance. Grain was bulky, animals required pasture, winter quarters had to be chosen with care. Local allies might provide supplies willingly at first, but enthusiasm could fade when stores emptied and fields suffered. An army that promised protection could become a burden if it stayed too long. Rome used this pressure where it could. Commanders fortified positions, guarded roads, threatened communities that leaned toward Hannibal, and punished those that had openly defected. The Republic's strength lay in returning again and again. A town might welcome Hannibal when his army stood nearby, but Roman forces could reappear months later with siege works, legal vengeance, and memories of betrayal. This endurance slowly changed the emotional calculation of alliance. Capua eventually became the great example of Roman punishment. The city's defection had wounded Roman pride, and its recovery became a central objective. Roman armies invested Capua, cutting it off and forcing Hannibal to respond. He tried to relieve the pressure, moving in ways meant to disturb the besiegers and threaten Roman attention elsewhere. The struggle around Capua revealed the hard fact of the war after Cannae. Hannibal could win battles, but Rome could choose targets and persist around them. In 211 BC, Hannibal made his famous movement toward Rome itself, partly to draw Roman forces away from Capua. The phrase Hannibal at the gates later became part of Roman memory, carrying the fear of a foreign enemy near the city, but the movement did not produce the relief he needed. Rome did not abandon the siege in the decisive way required. The capital was alarmed, yet the Republic's strategic grip held. Capua fell. The punishment of Capua was severe. Its leading men faced execution, imprisonment, or dispossession. Its political autonomy was broken. Its lands were taken into Roman control. The treatment sent a message through Italy. Defection could bring hope while Hannibal was near, but Roman return could bring ruin after he moved away. The lesson was practical and cold. Rome did not need to persuade every ally with affection if it could make betrayal appear too costly. Hannibal continued to maneuver in southern Italy, especially among the Brutians, where he retained support for years. The landscape there offered rougher country, local loyalties, and positions from which he could maintain a stubborn presence. Yet the scale of his earlier opportunity had narrowed. Each year brought losses that could not easily be replaced, allies whose confidence needed renewal, and Roman commanders who had learned not to be drawn carelessly into his strongest kind of war. Carthaginian support remained insufficient for the scale of the task. Reinforcements and supplies did come at times, and the war extended across several theaters, but Hannibal never received the overwhelming backing that might have allowed him to transform southern Italy into a secure alternate state. Carthage had commitments in Spain, Africa, Sicily, and diplomacy beyond the western Mediterranean. It also had political divisions and strategic caution of its own. Hannibal's army in Italy remained extraordinary, but not inexhaustible. The Sicilian theater added another layer of strain and possibility. Syracuse, after the death of King Hero II and changes in local politics, became involved in the wider conflict against Rome. Carthage hoped to regain influence there, while Rome fought hard to prevent Sicily from becoming a secure enemy base. The Roman capture of Syracuse, associated with the command of Marcus Claudius Marcellus and the death of Archimedes in later tradition, removed another possible source of strategic relief for Hannibal. The Mediterranean around him did not open as he needed it to open. In Italy itself, Roman commanders gradually reclaimed ground. Marcellus, Fabius, and others pressed the war through sieges, smaller engagements, and patient recovery. They did not need to match Hannibal's most brilliant victories. They needed to reduce his options. A captured town here, a restored ally there, a blocked supply route, a guarded road, a defeated lieutenant, a lost harbor. Each event narrowed the Carthaginian commander's room to act. The war became a slow closing of spaces. Hannibal's presence still carried danger. Roman armies respected him, and not without reason. When opportunities appeared, he could still strike with skill, and his reputation made commanders cautious. Soldiers who faced him knew they were not facing an ordinary enemy. Even after years in Italy, he retained enough authority over a mixed army to keep it together under hardship. That achievement alone was remarkable. Many armies built from different peoples dissolve when fortune turns. His endured. Yet endurance was not the same as victory. The more years passed, the more Hannibal's war depended on events outside his immediate control. He needed greater allied defections, stronger Carthaginian reinforcement, a decisive change in Sicily, or success in Spain that would keep Roman pressure divided. Rome, for its part, could suffer local defeats and still continue the larger recovery. Its institutions had learned to turn time against the invader. The long war in Italy therefore transformed Hannibal's greatest strength into a burden he had to carry. He remained the man who had crossed the Alps, shattered armies, and shaken Rome's allies, but now he also had to defend defecting cities, manage supply, preserve veteran troops, and keep alive a political promise that became harder to fulfill each season. Cannae had created a doorway. Rome did not close it at once, but year by year, through punishment, patience, and recovery, it made the passage narrower. By the later years of the Italian campaign, Hannibal was still undefeated in the deeper sense that no Roman commander had destroyed him in open battle. Yet the war around him had changed shape. Rome no longer needed to defeat him in the old way. It could isolate him, reduce his allies, reclaim cities, and attack the foundations of Barcid power elsewhere. The man who had once made Italy tremble now found himself holding a shrinking war in the south, while beyond the peninsula, another Roman commander was beginning to change the future of the conflict. Chapter 12: Scipio and the War Comes Home. While Hannibal held his narrowing war in Italy, the roots of his power were being attacked in Iberia. The Roman Republic had understood from early in the conflict that Spain was not a distant sideshow. It was the land that had supplied the Barcids with silver, troops, prestige, and strategic independence. If Rome could cut that western foundation away, Hannibal's victories in Italy would stand on thinner ground. The war would no longer be carried only by the man who crossed the Alps, but by the resources that could no longer reach him. The first Roman effort in Iberia had been led by the Scipio brothers, Publius Cornelius Scipio and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio. Their campaigns kept Carthaginian commanders occupied and prevented an easy flow of reinforcements into Italy. Spain was too large and varied to be controlled by one movement. Its rivers, coast roads, fortified towns, mining regions, and local alliances required years of pressure. Rome was learning to fight the Barcid system not only by confronting Hannibal, but by pulling at the threads behind him. The deaths of the Scipio brothers in 211 BC created a serious crisis for Rome and Spain. Carthaginian forces, including Hasdrubal Barca and other commanders, had managed to strike back hard. Roman armies were broken, commanders killed, and the whole position threatened. For a moment, the Western theater looked as though it might return to Carthaginian control. If that happened, Hannibal might yet receive the reinforcement, money, and strategic relief he had long needed. Into this uncertainty came Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the consul wounded at Ticinus and the nephew of Gnaeus. He was still young for such responsibility, but his family name, personal confidence, and public promise carried weight. Roman tradition remembered him as marked for greatness, though later admiration has to be separated from the practical courage of the appointment. He took command in Spain when the situation there was dangerous and when failure could have restored the Barcid West to full strength. Scipio inherited not only soldiers, but a problem of trust. Roman forces had suffered losses, local allies were watching carefully, and Iberian communities had to decide whether Rome was a passing danger or a durable power. In that world, a commander needed more than Roman discipline. He needed speed, generosity, intelligence, and the ability to make local leaders believe that changing sides would not leave them exposed. Spain rewarded the commander who could combine battle with politics. His great early stroke was the capture of New Carthage in 2009 BC. The city was the heart of Carthaginian Spain, harbor, arsenal, treasury, administrative center, hostage depot, and symbol of Barcid rule. To seize it was to strike not merely a town, but a system. Its position on the southeastern coast gave it access to sea routes and inland wealth. Its walls, lagoon, harbor, and stores made it a prize whose value reached far beyond the stones of the city itself. The operation showed Scipio's eye for opportunity. Ancient accounts describe how he learned details of the city's geography, including the shallow lagoon or tidal conditions that could make an unexpected approach possible. Whether every detail has been polished by later telling, the broad point remains. New Carthage fell because Scipio combined speed, preparation, and local knowledge. He did not wait for a slow, heavy siege to announce Roman intentions. He struck at the place where Carthaginian power in Spain was most concentrated. Inside the city lay the practical wealth of empire. There were weapons, ships, money, supplies, and hostages from Iberian communities whose loyalty had been secured by keeping their sons, daughters, or relatives under Carthaginian control. Hostages were not incidental. They were living guarantees, reminders that alliance in the ancient world often rested on the bodies of the young and prominent. A commander who held them held leverage over families and towns far beyond the city walls. Scipio's treatment of these hostages became one of the foundations of his political success. Rather than simply using them as Carthage had used them, he returned many with gestures of respect, presenting Rome as a more reliable and honorable patron. Such acts were not sentimental decoration, they were instruments of diplomacy. A released hostage could carry gratitude home, and a local ruler could see in Roman power something other than punishment. Scipio understood that mercy, when carefully used, could become a form of command. The capture of New Carthage also damaged Carthaginian logistics. Supplies, stores, and money that might have supported armies were now lost or redirected. The symbolic injury was just as large. The city founded or strengthened as a Western Carthage had fallen to Rome. Iberian leaders who had once measured loyalty according to Barcid strength now had reason to reconsider. In a theater built from alliances, the sight of a central stronghold changing hands could alter many smaller calculations. Hasdrubal Barca remained the most important Carthaginian commander in Spain. As Hannibal's brother, he carried both military authority and family meaning. If he could break through to Italy with an army, the whole shape of the war might change. Hannibal had long been fighting with insufficient reinforcement. A second Barcid army entering the peninsula could renew pressure on Rome, unsettle its allies, and perhaps create the combined strength that had been missing after Cannae. The struggle between Scipio and the Carthaginian commanders moved through battles, alliances, and attempts to control the interior. Bacula, fought in 208 BC, became one of the significant encounters between Scipio and Hasdrubal. The battle did not end the war in Spain at once, and Hasdrubal managed to withdraw with part of his force. Roman accounts naturally emphasize Scipio's success, while the strategic result was more complex. Hasdrubal had been checked, but not destroyed. Hasdrubal then made the decision that Rome most feared. He moved north, intending to follow the broad pattern of Hannibal's earlier march and reach Italy. The fact that he could attempt this after years of Roman pressure shows that Carthaginian strength in Spain had not vanished immediately with New Carthage. Armies could still be gathered, routes could still be found. The Barcid family still possessed enough prestige and command capacity to threaten a second invasion. His march differed from Hannibal's in important ways. Hannibal's crossing had stunned Rome partly because it was unexpected and because the Republic had not yet learned the full shape of the war. By the time Hasdrubal moved, Rome had years of painful experience behind it. Roads were watched more closely. Commanders understood the danger of joining Barcid armies, and the memory of Cannae made the possibility of reinforcement feel urgent. A second Carthaginian army in Italy could not be allowed to unite with the first. The decisive moment came at the Metaturus River in 207 BC. Roman commanders, including Gaius Claudius Nero and Marcus Livius Salinator, acted with speed and coordination. Nero had been facing Hannibal in the south, but he made a rapid secret march north with selected troops to reinforce the army opposing Hasdrubal. This movement required discipline and risk. He had to leave enough force to contain Hannibal while carrying useful strength across distance before the enemy understood what had happened. The Battle of the Metaturus ended with Hasdrubal's defeat and death. It was one of the turning points of the entire war, though it has often stood in the shadow of Cannae. At Cannae, Hannibal had shown what could happen when Rome fought under conditions he prepared. At Metaturus, Rome prevented the strategic union that might have given Hannibal a renewed chance. The destruction of Hasdrubal's army meant that the brother who had come to save or strengthen the Italian campaign would never reach him. Ancient tradition remembers the news reaching Hannibal in a grim and personal form. Hasdrubal's severed head thrown into or near his camp by the Romans. The detail is harsh, and ancient war often used such gestures to break morale as much as to deliver information. The deeper historical meaning is clear without lingering on the cruelty. Hannibal learned that the reinforcement he needed had failed and that his brother was dead. The Italian war, already narrowing, had lost its most plausible path to revival. For Hannibal, Hasdrubal's death was more than a family loss. It was the collapse of a strategic hope. A joined Barcid force might have changed Rome's calculations, forced new defections, or opened another sequence of movement. Instead, Rome's ability to act across theaters had been proven. It could fight Hannibal in the south, intercept Hasdrubal in the north, and keep pressure on Spain. The republic that had seemed almost broken after Cannae was now coordinating a wider recovery. Scipio continued the Spanish campaign until Carthaginian power there was effectively broken. The Battle of Ilipa in 26 BC confirmed the Roman advantage and helped end the Barcid military structure in Iberia. Scipio used flexible deployment, careful timing, and the lessons of years in the field to defeat the Carthaginian forces. The victory did not merely add another Roman success, it removed Spain as the great western base that Hamilcar, Hasdrubal, and Hannibal had built over decades. The loss of Iberia changed the war's geography. Silver mines, recruiting grounds, hostages, coastal bases, and Barcid prestige no longer worked in Carthage's favor as they once had. Hannibal remained in Italy still dangerous, still respected, still capable of commanding loyalty from hardened troops. but the foundation behind him had been cut away. The war was no longer moving outward from the Barcid west, it was beginning to turn back toward Africa. Scipio's success in Spain also shaped his imagination. He had seen that Carthaginian power could be defeated by attacking its base rather than merely reacting to its most famous commander. He had learned Iberian diplomacy, rapid movement, siegecraft, alliance management, and the political value of calculated generosity. These lessons would follow him beyond Spain. The young commander who captured New Carthage did not intend to spend the rest of the war answering Hannibal from a distance. Rome by now had changed from the city stunned by Trasimene and Cannae. It had suffered, adjusted, and learned. Its commanders no longer all sought the same kind of decisive battle on Hannibal's terms. Its armies operated in several theaters, and its political will had survived long enough for new leaders to mature inside the war itself. Scipio belonged to that generation. He had grown up in the shadow of Hannibal's invasion, and his career took shape as Rome's answer became more patient, wider, and more ambitious. The war came home to Carthage in stages before any Roman army landed in Africa. It came through the fall of New Carthage, through the release of hostages, through Iberian defections, through Hasdrubal's failed march, and through the removal of Spain from the Carthaginian system. Hannibal still stood in Italy, but the balance had shifted around him. The conflict that began with his movement toward Rome was now turning toward the city that had sent him forth. Scipio had found the road by which Rome would carry the danger back across the sea. Chapter 13: Zama and the End of the Dream. By the time the war turned toward Africa, Hannibal had spent more than a decade in Italy. He had entered the peninsula as the commander who crossed the Alps, defeated consular armies, and stood after Cannae with the Roman Republic wounded before him. Years had changed the shape of that achievement. Cities had defected and been recovered. Allies had wavered and been punished. His brother Hasdrubal had failed to reach him. Spain, the western foundation of Barcid power, had been lost. Scipio now carried the war across the sea. This was the move Hannibal had once made against Rome in reverse. Instead of waiting for the enemy in a familiar theater, the Roman commander attacked the political heartland behind the enemy's field army. Africa was not merely Carthage's homeland in a sentimental sense. It was land, grain, tribute, estates, allied kings, ports, cavalry, and the civic body that had to decide whether to continue a war that had already lasted for years. The Carthaginian position depended heavily on Numidian politics. Numidian cavalry had long been among the finest mounted forces in the western Mediterranean, and Hannibal had used such horsemen with great effect in Italy. But allegiance among Numidian leaders was not fixed. Kings and princes weighed advantage, rivalry, and survival. Syphax of the Massacili and Massinissa of the Massili became central figures in this shifting world, and Scipio understood that a cavalry alliance in Africa could change the balance of war. Massinissa's move toward Rome proved especially important. He had earlier been connected to Carthaginian service, but his ambitions and rivalries drew him into Scipio's orbit. This was not a minor diplomatic ornament. Cavalry had helped Hannibal win at Ticinus, Trebia, Trasimene's aftermath, and Cannae. If Rome could now gain strong Numidian support, the old Carthaginian advantage in mounted warfare might be reversed. A war shaped for years by Hannibal's cavalry would now confront him with cavalry in Roman hands. Scipio's campaign in Africa placed Carthage under a pressure it could not treat as distant. Roman forces moved near the city's sphere, allies were threatened, and Carthaginian leaders faced the frightening possibility that the war had come back to the coast from which Hannibal had once departed. Armies in Italy could be endured as long as Africa remained secure. A Roman army in Africa altered the emotional and political calculation. The city that had sent Hannibal away now needed him home. Hannibal's recall from Italy was one of the quiet turning points of his life. He had spent his mature command there, among veterans who had followed him through seasons of victory, shortage, movement, and narrowing hope. To leave Italy was not simply to change theaters. It meant admitting that the long project of breaking Rome through its alliances had failed. The war would now be decided not in the fields where he had made his name, but near the city whose cause he had carried since childhood. The troops he brought back were not the same army that had descended from the Alps. Many of the earliest veterans had died, aged, or been absorbed into the long hardship of the Italian campaign. Those who remained had extraordinary experience, but their numbers were limited. Carthage also raised new forces in Africa, including citizen troops and less seasoned men. The army that would face Scipio was therefore uneven, part hardened memory, part emergency assembly. Carthage made attempts at negotiation as the danger sharpened. Ancient accounts preserve exchanges, truces, disputes over captured ships or supplies, and arguments over responsibility. Peace was possible in theory, but each side had reason to distrust the other. Rome had suffered too much to accept a settlement that left Carthage strong enough to renew the struggle. Carthage wanted terms that preserved dignity and survival. Between those needs lay the battlefield that would decide how much choice remained. The reported meeting between Hannibal and Scipio before Zama belongs among the most compelling traditions of the war. Two commanders, each carrying a generation's burden, are said to have spoken before the battle. Hannibal, older and marked by long campaigning, supposedly urged peace. Scipio, younger but now commanding from strength, insisted on terms shaped by Rome's advantage. The exact words cannot be recovered, and ancient writers may have polished the scene. Still, the tradition captures a real historical symmetry. The man who had brought war into Italy now faced the man who had brought it back to Africa. The battle took place in 202 BC near Zama, though the precise location remains debated. What matters is the setting of an open African field where armies could deploy, cavalry could move, and the long contest between Roman adaptation and Carthaginian experience came to its final test. Hannibal's army included elephants, infantry of mixed quality, and a line of veterans whose discipline had been formed in Italy. Scipio commanded Roman troops hardened by years of war, supported by Numidian cavalry under Massinissa and others. The elephants were placed at the front of Hannibal's line, intended to disrupt Roman order before the infantry engagement. Elephants could frighten horses, break formations, and create openings if they struck at the right moment. Yet they were also difficult to control, especially against troops prepared for them. An elephant that panicked could turn back into its own lines. Such animals carried both promise and danger, and by Zama the Romans had learned from years of facing Carthaginian methods. Scipio arranged his infantry with lanes or intervals that allowed the elephants to pass through rather than crash into an unbroken wall of men. Trumpets, noise, Missiles and disciplined movement helped blunt the charge. Some elephants were driven aside, some moved through the gaps, others caused confusion among Hannibal's own forces, or were handled without the devastation intended. The opening of the battle showed how much Rome had learned. What had once been strange and terrifying could now be answered by preparation. The cavalry fight then moved against Hannibal. Roman and Numidian horse defeated or drew away the Carthaginian cavalry, removing the mounted support on which so many of his earlier victories had depended. The field at Zama did not give him the same balance he had known at Cannae. In Italy, his cavalry had closed the trap. In Africa, the enemy's cavalry would return later to complete it. The reversal was not symbolic only, it altered the practical movement of the battle. The infantry struggle unfolded in stages. Hannibal's first lines engaged the Romans, and the fighting was hard. The men at the front did not decide ancient battles by intention alone. They pushed, held, gave ground, closed gaps, stepped over bodies and broken equipment, and tried to keep formation while officers called them forward. Behind them stood other lines whose commitment had to be timed carefully. Hannibal's arrangement depended on maintaining order between troops of different experience and loyalty. Tension developed between the earlier lines and the veterans held behind. Ancient accounts suggest that when the first Carthaginian lines were driven back, they were not easily received by the troops behind them, whether because of discipline, distrust, or battlefield confusion. The withdrawal did not create a smooth new formation. Mixed armies could be powerful when every part performed its role, but under pressure their differences could reappear. At Zama, Hannibal needed cohesion from men who had not all shared the same long road. At last the veterans from Italy came fully into the battle. These were the men who carried the deepest memory of Hannibal's command: campaigns in Italy, victories against Roman armies, years of hardship, and the pride of having stood with him when Rome seemed vulnerable. Their presence gave the final infantry contest its weight. Scipio's Romans faced not raw levies alone, but the surviving core of the army that had once shaken the Republic. The fight between these experienced forces was close enough that the battle did not belong to Scipio from the first hour. Hannibal remained Hannibal, and his veterans remained dangerous. Scipio, however, had learned to keep his troops organized through the stages of combat, and Roman flexibility had improved since the disasters of earlier years. The old difference between Roman courage and Hannibal's design had narrowed. Rome was no longer offering itself to be shaped by his preferred battlefield. The return of the Roman and Numidian cavalry decided the matter. Having driven off their opponents, they came back upon Hannibal's infantry from the rear. The movement recalls Cannae in broad form, but with the direction of history reversed. At Cannae, Roman infantry had been enclosed by Hannibal's mounted success and tactical patience. At Zama, Hannibal's forces found the rear danger returning against them. The commander who had once used cavalry to complete destruction now suffered from its absence. Carthage was defeated. Hannibal survived the battle, but survival no longer carried the same meaning it had after earlier campaigns. After Trebia, Trasimene, or Cannae, victory had widened possibility. After Zama, defeat narrowed the future of an entire state. The army was broken, the Roman commander held the advantage, and Carthage could no longer bargain as an equal. The city had to face terms shaped by the enemy it had tried for generations to contain. The peace that followed ended Carthage's position as a great military power. It had to surrender its war fleet, except for a small number of ships, pay a heavy indemnity over many years, give up claims outside Africa, and agree not to wage war without Roman permission. These terms did more than punish a defeated enemy. They removed the instruments by which Carthage could independently recover, as it had after the First Punic War. Rome had learned from the earlier peace and made the second one harder to escape. For Hannibal personally, Zama ended the dream inherited from Hamilcar. The oath against Rome, the building of Barcid Spain, the crossing of the Alps, the long years in Italy, the hope of Allied collapse, and the return to Africa all came to rest under Roman terms. He had defeated Rome's armies more brilliantly than any Carthaginian before him. Yet he could not defeat the system that replaced armies, held alliances, absorbed grief, and produced Scipio when the war had lasted long enough. Scipio emerged from the victory with the name Africanus, a title that tied his identity to the continent where the war had been decided. His achievement was not simply that he beat Hannibal in battle. He had attacked Spain, reshaped alliances, brought war to Africa, gained Numidian support, and forced Carthage to recall its greatest commander under unfavorable conditions. Zama was the visible end of a wider strategy. It showed Rome no longer reacting to Hannibal's movement, but compelling Hannibal to answer Rome's. The battlefield near Zama did not erase Hannibal's earlier victories. It changed their meaning. Cannae remained a masterpiece, the Alps remained an astonishing passage, and the name Hannibal continued to carry fear. But after 202 BC, those memories belonged to a defeated cause. Carthage survived, yet under limits. Rome survived, and now stood with a new confidence across the western Mediterranean. The man who had almost broken its rise had instead taught it how dangerous the world could be, and Rome answered by becoming harder to break. Chapter 14: Exile, Pursuit, and Memory. After Zama, Hannibal returned to a Carthage that had survived but no longer stood as it once had. The city still possessed harbors, walls, temples, wealthy families, workshops, farms, merchants, and the habits of an old Mediterranean power. Ships still came and went, and the markets did not fall silent because one battle had been lost. Yet the peace with Rome had placed firm limits around its future. Carthage could live, trade, and pay, but it could not freely wage war, rebuild a great fleet, or recover the Western Empire that had sustained the Barcids. For Hannibal, defeat did not at once mean disappearance. He was still a man of immense reputation, known not only to Carthage, but to the whole Mediterranean world. No one who had crossed the Alps, won at Cannae, and held an army together in Italy for so many years could return as an ordinary citizen. His presence carried honor, danger, resentment, and memory. Some Carthaginians may have admired him as the greatest commander their city had produced. Others had reason to fear that Rome would never rest easily while he remained influential. The peace terms required Carthage to pay a heavy indemnity over decades. Such payments were not abstract punishments. They had to be gathered from real sources: estates, trade, taxes, public revenues, and the wealth of families who did not always welcome scrutiny. A defeated city could appear calm from the outside while arguments over money moved through council chambers and private houses. Rome's victory reached into account books. warehouses, farms, and the obligations of office. Hannibal eventually became a leading magistrate in Carthage, commonly identified with the office of Suffete. The precise character of Carthaginian institutions is filtered through Greek and Roman descriptions, but the office carried serious civic authority. This phase of his life is easily overshadowed by battles, yet it reveals another side of him. He was not only a commander of armies, he understood administration, faction, finance, and the way a city could be weakened by its own internal arrangements. His reforms appear to have challenged entrenched interests. Ancient accounts suggest that Hannibal exposed corruption and reorganized public revenues so effectively that Carthage could meet its payments to Rome without crushing the population as heavily as before. The details are not fully recoverable, but the general meaning is plausible. A city burdened by indemnity needed honest collection and disciplined management. Men who had benefited from loose practices would not welcome a famous soldier turning his attention to accounts. There is a quiet irony in this period. The man Rome remembered as its greatest enemy helped make defeated Carthage financially healthier under Roman-imposed terms. He did not liberate the city from its obligations, but he tried to make it capable of bearing them. The work lacked the visible grandeur of an Alpine crossing, yet it required courage of another kind. A reformer inside a wounded aristocratic city could make enemies without drawing a sword. Those enemies had a powerful weapon, Roman suspicion. Hannibal's name itself could be used as a signal. If he was accused of plotting with foreign kings or preparing renewed war, Rome would listen. Whether every accusation against him was true is difficult to know, but Rome did not need certainty in the modern sense. The Republic had spent too many years fighting him to treat his influence as harmless. A living Hannibal was a strategic fact. Roman envoys eventually came to Carthage, and Hannibal understood what their arrival meant. He had spent his life reading danger before it fully closed. Rather than submit to arrest or allow his enemies to hand him over, he fled the city. The departure has the feeling of a second exile layered over the first. He had left Carthage as a boy to follow Hamilcar into Iberia. Now, as an older man, he left not for conquest, but because the city he had served could no longer protect him. His flight carried him eastward, into a Mediterranean where Rome's reach was growing but not yet absolute. The Hellenistic kingdoms still had courts, armies, fleets, dynastic quarrels, and ambitions of their own. Kings ruled lands shaped by Alexander's successors, Greek cities, old local powers, and the constant pressure of diplomacy. A man like Hannibal could find welcome there, not because he was peaceful, but because his knowledge of Rome was valuable. He had studied the Republic in the hardest possible school. At the court of Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, Hannibal entered a very different political world from Carthage or Rome. Antiochus ruled a vast and complicated kingdom stretching across parts of the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia. His court contained advisors, generals, envoys, Greek intellectuals, local officials, and men whose fortunes depended on royal favor. In such surroundings, Hannibal was both honored and constrained. He was famous enough to be useful, but foreign enough to be watched. Antiochus considered war with Rome, and Hannibal's presence gave that possibility a certain weight. Ancient sources suggest that Hannibal advised bold action, including perhaps carrying war into Italy again, or using naval and Western strategies more aggressively. How much influence he truly held is uncertain. Kings often listened to famous exiles without surrendering policy to them. Hannibal could offer experience, but he could not make Antiochus into Hamilcar, nor the Seleucid army into the force he had once led across the Alps. The war between Rome and Antiochus did not unfold in the way Hannibal would have needed. Roman power reached eastward with growing confidence, supported by allies and by commanders trained in decades of large-scale conflict. Antiochus was defeated, and the settlement that followed reduced his freedom of action. Hannibal again found himself too dangerous to be left in peace and not powerful enough to command events. The pattern of his later life began to repeat. A court offered shelter, Rome applied pressure, and the old enemy moved on. In these years, Hannibal became a kind of wandering warning. He passed through the courts of rulers who resented or feared Rome, yet his very presence could invite Roman attention. He was valuable because he had almost defeated the Republic, and burdensome for the same reason. A king might welcome his counsel in private and hesitate to be seen as his protector in public. The world was changing around him. Rome no longer belonged only to Italy and the Western Sea. Its shadow was stretching into the east. He eventually came to Bithynia, a kingdom in northwestern Asia Minor ruled by Prusias I. Bithynia was not one of the great imperial powers of the age, but it occupied a useful position among the rivalries of Anatolia and the wider Hellenistic world. Hannibal is said to have aided Prusias in conflict with Pergamum, even offering naval stratagems in later tradition. These stories, whatever their exact detail, preserve the image of an aging commander still thinking tactically, still applying intelligence to smaller wars after the great one had passed beyond recovery. Rome did not forget him. That is one of the clearest facts of his final years. Many defeated generals vanish into obscurity once their armies are gone, but Hannibal remained present in Roman political imagination. Envoys could still ask about him. Rulers could still be pressured over him. His name had become more than the name of a man. It was a memory of danger that Rome preferred not to leave loose in the world. The end came around 1803 BC, according to the commonly accepted chronology in Bithynia. Roman envoys had pressed Prusias, and Hannibal saw that surrender was approaching. Ancient tradition says he took poison that he had long kept ready for such a moment. The exact words attributed to him before death are literary in shape, as ancient death scenes often are. The essential movement is simpler and sadder. He chose not to be displayed, judged, or carried into Roman hands. His death in exile stands far from the fields that made him famous. No great army surrounded him. No allied city waited for his decision. The veterans of Italy were gone or old. The Barcid power in Spain had vanished, and Carthage lived under Roman limits. A life that had once moved through the largest spaces of the western Mediterranean ended in a smaller kingdom, under diplomatic pressure, with escape narrowed to a private act. Carthage itself continued after Hannibal, but not freely. The city regained prosperity in trade and agriculture, and its resilience troubled Roman observers in later generations. Yet the political world had changed. Rome had learned to fear Carthaginian recovery, even when Carthage had no Hannibal. In 1406 BC, long after Hannibal's death, the Third Punic War ended with the destruction of the city. That later catastrophe does not belong directly to his life, but it shows how deeply the rivalry endured after the man himself was gone. Roman writers preserved Hannibal with a mixture of hostility, admiration, anxiety, and moral use. Polybius, Livy, and later authors made him an example of strategic brilliance, oath-bound hatred, foreign danger, and the testing of Roman virtue. Their accounts are not neutral windows. They are memories shaped by the civilization that survived him. Yet this gives his reputation a strange power. Hannibal's name reached later centuries largely because his enemies could not stop speaking of him. The memory they kept was not only of Cannae, though Cannae remained central. It was the memory of a boy at an altar, a family rebuilding power in Spain, elephants crossing rivers, soldiers descending from the Alps, Roman consuls falling, and a city refusing to collapse. Hannibal's life became a way for Rome to remember the edge of its own possible ruin. He served, in Roman imagination, as proof that the Republic had once faced an enemy worthy of its fear. There is another way to see him, quieter and less Roman. Hannibal was a Carthaginian formed by defeat, trained in a Western empire his family had built, and drawn into a struggle between two systems of power. He won battles through patience, observation, discipline, and an unusual ability to command men from many peoples. He failed because battle could not alone dissolve Rome's institutions, because allies did not defect in sufficient number, because Carthage could not support him enough, and because time eventually carried the war to places he could not control. The final shape of his life rests between achievement and frustration. He almost changed the history of the Mediterranean, but almost is not a small word. It contains the Alps, Trasimene, Cannae, Capua, years in the south, Zama, reform, exile, and the long pursuit of a man Rome still feared when his armies were gone. Hannibal did not destroy Rome. Instead, he revealed what Rome could survive, and in doing so became one of the figures by whom Roman endurance measured itself. His story ends without the restoration Hamilcar may have imagined, and without the triumph Hannibal once seemed close to grasping. Yet the name endured in Roman histories, in military study, in the memory of Carthage, and in the long fascination with a commander who carried war over mountains into the heart of his enemy's world. The old roads are gone or changed, the passes disputed, the battlefields quiet beneath later centuries. But Hannibal remains there in the record, still moving through the western Mediterranean as the man Rome defeated, remembered, and never quite released.